Hello, welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're finishing our discussion with John Michael Cologne and moving on to modern media. But I'm going to let John Michael kind of summarize briefly what we talked about on the last show 2 weeks ago.
Right, yeah. So hi, everybody, and thank you, Varn, again for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. So for anybody who might not have seen the previous episode, we basically were trying to kind of do a big picture political economy infused history of media over the course of the last 100 years or so, maybe extending back to the early modern period in terms of the origin of print media, because the fundamental kind of assumption that we had going into the show was that how art or journalism and so on are made as a productive process, right? The way in which that knowledge is produced actually influences the final product in very significant ways, from the ownership structure and management structure of the firms in which it's produced to the to the incentives that come from the economic environment in which, and the technological environment in which that production is taking place, whether that's limitations or possibilities or whatever. So we went through basically like print media and the rise of like independent presses and the effect that that had on the creation of what Jürgen Habermas called the public sphere. We talked about the erosion of that public sphere in the 20th century, when the new media of the 20th century, that were new at the time, think broadcast television and radio, had these very overly centralized top-down command and control structures, whether by oligopolistic corporations like News Corp on the one hand, or by the state on the other hand, like state media. And because of the fact that these kind of like gigantomatic media that could show up in like every single home and every single bar and every single kind of like place in society, kind of crowd, but it was what actually showed up on those screens was under, or over those airwaves, was under centralized control and basically the censorship of the usually like corporate middle management executives. As a result of that, the media environment became much more centralized and authoritarian. This had all sorts of consequences, from the kind of self-referential, like parallel world of media that was described and critiqued by people like the Situationists and Umberto Eco and Baudrillard, through to the kind of like suffocation of civil society and the lack of independent voices or avant-garde works of art or radical politics anywhere that anyone could usually see it, because such things, if they existed at all, were so crowded out by centralized and standardized mass media that they could only exist in these little scenes in individual cities where people could only hear about it by word of mouth and so on, and it was very difficult to have any kind of saturation. But so this was the situation roughly through the social democratic period and the neoliberal period in the OECD countries. But then especially starting in like the 90s and 2000s, there was this shift where there began to be a kind of countercultural resurgence. I mean, some of this goes back to the 60s for sure, but in terms of like what we now think of as indie media, that was a phenomenon that sort of began in the 90s. And Varn actually talked a lot, wonderfully from personal experience, about some of these outfits. They tended to be small scale, localist, do-it-yourself kind of scenes, heavy initially on kind of like volunteer labor, because they weren't really like trying to make a lot of money. They were just seeking to perpetuate themselves, and oftentimes they were like the hobbyist projects of the people involved. Sometimes when they did have more money behind them, it was these kinds of like large scale donors who were in the shadows, although that of course led to its own form of control, because whoever is donating most of the money gets de facto control over it, because if they don't like what it is, they pull the money and the thing falls apart. But slowly, indie media and alt media, as it was called roughly in this time period. You can think of like Democracy Now! By Amy Goodman as the paradigmatic example of this, right? Started gravitating more and more away from those kinds of models of like pure volunteerism and rich donors, and more towards a model of crowdfunding. And this was becoming more possible due to the technological change of the internet, which we have not discussed that much up to now, but is actually going to be probably the central underlying material foundation of a lot of the things that we discuss in this episode, because for both lots of good and lots of ill, the rise of the internet radically changed what was possible in media. And it essentially, in the case of the indie media, opened up possibilities like crowdfunding, where, you know, through a website like Kickstarter or Indiegogo or whatever you want to call it, you can put up like, hey, this is my project and this is what I've done in the past and this is why you should think of me as somebody who's trustworthy. And people will give you money not on the basis of like, you know, they want a return on their investment, but rather on the basis of like they want this thing to happen. So like a medieval or Renaissance, you know, European art patron who's like an aristocrat who just wants the work of art to exist, for a more or less inherent reason, rather than like you know, for its use value, let's say, rather than because they want to, you know, flip it on some market. In the same way, individuals contributing small amounts like $25 will donate to some project, not because they expect a return on their investment, but because they want the thing to exist. Except that instead of one patron, it's many patrons, which from the point of view of the artist opens up the possibility of basically, like, it lowers your risk, because it's not like one person who can grab all the money that they were giving you and run. It's a bunch of people donating small amounts, which gives you, or at least the thought was, initially, like, more independence than you ever had before. Certainly, you know, compared to the option of, you know, either doing stuff, you know, with no budget whatsoever in obscurity in some corner, or, you know, paying the price that it took to end up in a broadsheet newspaper or end up on a television screen, which was to pass the test of the gatekeepers controlling those institutions, most of whom were totally subordinated to the interests of the owning classes, who controlled all that centralized mass media. So this was roughly the place where we ended, was this kind of like transitional moment of the early 2000s. But a lot of what happens after that is what is probably of most interest to our audience, right? Because that's going to be the stuff that pertains to us and our media environment. And maybe we can start through this conversation reconstructing what exactly that environment looks like.
So, what are the major changes in the internet that you think has really contributed to the change of the media environment? I've even noticed massive changes in like YouTube successful platforms, whether or not streaming is effective, et cetera, in ways that have thrown people that I work with for a loop. Um, so, what do you see as changing, and what are the big changes in the last, say, 10 years?
Well, that's going to be a whole discussion. So feel free to interject. You know, whenever there's something that you can think of that I've missed. But I think that probably, if I were to pick a place to start, because it's a lot to grapple with, I think that the important thing is to contrast what the internet was like, especially before social media, because now it's a lot more complicated with social media, but like, you know, compared to the old system, right? So the old system is centralized and top down, and you basically have to pass through the gatekeepers. The new system on the internet was basically like zero startup costs, right? It's like, I mean, effectively zero, like under $100, right? You've got a podcast mic, and you know, I just realized I probably should have grabbed my snowball, but it's far away, so I'm not going to get it. You know, you've got your podcast mic, and you've got your internet connection, and maybe you get a domain name for a website, which is going to run you like, you know, 20 to 50 bucks, you know, and that's probably if you get ripped off. You know, and you know, you're ready to go, right? Like you can start broadcasting. You set up a YouTube account and you can put stuff up there. So very low capital intensity, you know, compared to old media production. But, and here's the thing, potential mass reach, because the internet is this massive interconnected system, right? It's basically like all the computers of the world being able to connect to each other, and we have all these, you know, we have the protocols that allow you to surf the web and have them all be able to communicate with each other, and you have the browsers. Initially, I'm talking like in the beginning, right? Like, you know, in the 90s, you had like your Netscape browser, your Internet Explorer, or whatever. Google comes out with the best search engine, which you can use to basically like look up anything that you want that's been put up on the internet, and more things are being put up on the internet because this like larger infrastructure exists. And it's not that this is like this like totally, anarchic utopia. I don't want to like, there are definitely like capitalist interests involved in this because, for example, you have the internet service providers, right? The ISPs, and if for some reason or another, and sometimes it's good reasons, right? Because this is like child pornography as well, like was one of the big things to be targeted very early on. The ISPs, if they catch wind that you're doing it on their services, they're going to take it down unilaterally because they own the service. But the thing about the internet, just kind of like fundamentally, because of the way that it's structured, you can usually, and this was especially true like before the 2010s, I think, you can usually find a workaround, right? Like think of the Pirate Bay. Pirate Bay is more or less openly advertising itself. You don't need Tor to access it or anything like that. Although it's probably advisable if you're the sort of person who's going to do that. Not that I recommend that you do, but Pirate Bay is openly advertising, and it's been for like decades that you can download any movie, any music album, whatever, and LibGen, same for books, right? Like Sci-Hub, same for scientific journal articles. And it's not like people aren't aware, right? The publishers and so on are aware that these things exist. But the thing is that you can always find a workaround. If you get banned in one country, somebody's already made like a bunch of copies of the database, and they can just put it up and like the latest version of it, and they can just put it up on the servers in some other country that's going to be more favorable. And then if it gets cracked down, they move it to somewhere else. So the but if they put it up anywhere, everyone everywhere can see it. And again, mutatis mutandis for like historical situations. Obviously, the Great Firewall of China, kind of a racist name, but that's what they call it. Was probably the first example of that not necessarily being the case, because there's a very distinct Chinese internet that is insulated from the rest of the world's internet, and there's also a good chance. There's a lot of trends pushing the internet, especially in the last 10 years, to fragment. But on the whole, the characteristic nature of the internet as an infrastructure for telecommunications in the last like 15, 20 years has been its openness and its decentralization. So the, and what that allows is for this situation where you can get around the censors, basically, of your country, of your society, and put stuff up. But then, like, when you put it up, it has the potential to go viral. Like, it can, anyone all over the world can see what you did and potentially link to it, and potentially link it to some larger website that is more prominent on the search engines, which directs eyeballs to your thing. So again, some younger people watching this might be a little confused because I haven't mentioned social media. I'm trying to kind of describe what the internet was like before social media. And it was very much more search engine driven. It was very much more kind of like in this milieu. And this was kind of when the first alt media started emerging. They emerged in this kind of ecosystem. And it was also when the first kind of crowdfunding technology, sort of in the tail end of the 2000s, I would say, early 2010s, you started getting like Kickstarter, Indiegogo. Eventually Patreon came out, and that was a really big one because that allowed for kind of ongoing subscriptions that were like micro subscriptions. And that ended up kind of like creating the boom, I think, of alt media, which now we're in a situation where where as a result of these technologies, and we're going to get to the ugly stuff probably right next, but the initial kind of utopian idealistic version of where things were going was that, for the first time you were seeing this proliferation of new sorts of media enterprises, many of them of a politically left-wing or artistically avant-garde bent, or both, because in fact these two things kind of went together all through the 2000s and the 2010s. That were creating a real viable alternative to the centralized mass media, which increasingly came to be called legacy media. That tends to be how we discuss the 20th century centralized mass media nowadays. We call them legacy media, these alternative forms of publications and and broadcasts basically started providing an alternative that was viable because it was actually starting to get mass reach through the virality which was possible due to the internet. So that was the kind of premise of the new media environment, and it was something that I think both Varn and I, not to put words in your mouth, but I think we discussed last time how both of us were kind of I'm a little younger than you, but we were both kind of swept up in the attempt to kind of be a part of this as it was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I was involved in both the shifts on media, but I would say that what was interesting is I saw social media starting to be actually a limit to the organic engagement pretty early. Like I would say, I saw the change happen around 2013, and that's when you
Yeah,
started seeing blogs die. So that
yeah. Could
wasn't
you?
just that wasn't just like people think that was just because, like, I don't know, younger millennials and zoomers don't read, but what it actually seems to have been is that blogs were actually hampered deliberately under Facebook's media plan, and this was at the point where Facebook became 80% of all internet traffic.
Yeah, could you actually describe that? Because you kind of got into it last time, but I think you were looking at it pretty close from from what I can gather. So I think that maybe elaborating some of your experiences with Facebook might be a good way to get into some of these ugly incentives.
So I mean, one of the things to look at um is what I saw, for example, when Facebook first did its monetarization policy. It hampered blogs specifically, and you remember in the aughts, blogs were huge,
Yeah,
but they were decentralized largely, and they were kind of commodifiable, but it was a lot harder. Um, you do it off ads, uh, so one of the things that changed, I was running a left wing blog that had grown under Occupy. Um, I had ran North Star with the late Paul Shetler, Dario Kosovich, Ben Campbell, and Fan Bing, and we paid for a bunch of access on North Star. So our likes exploded. Like we just dumped a bunch of private money into it actually and a lot of left publications did. But what we noticed at first is our clicks didn't change at all, just our seeming like rate. So it was being farmed out. Now that kind of got fixed later. Now I didn't pay for anything on the literary magazine because we just weren't making money. But we saw organic shares drop by 50 to 60% the moment the algorithm changed, and it caused us to lose a lot of impetus for what we were doing. Um, Whereas moving to YouTube, I think partly because of association with Google, I don't know that. Moving to video and audio, the audio bypassed Facebook largely because the RSS feeder still worked. And so it wasn't as important to be shared on Facebook in the same way. And YouTube didn't seem as hampered, partly because it seemed to be an advertising um, uh, things. And yeah, someone said, didn't the introduction of Facebook in some countries in Asia lead to intensification of ugly rifts and unproductive rifts in population? Yeah, but that's actually the same trend that people saw as its liberating force it was what people were celebrating in the color revolutions and then later on in the Arab Spring.
right.
Um,
Yeah, I
so
mean the idea was that the disruption that was being made possible by people suddenly being able to connect to other people directly would lead to a new age of revolution. It kind of did initially, kind of more so than I think the tech companies or the American military intelligence services wanted it to, right? Because it started happening here at home as well. And one of the things that we know about Occupy Wall Street is, back in the day, Anonymous was still active and heavily involved. There was the hacker space was not really yet an alt right space, and now it's kind of veering back, I would argue, towards leftism. But for a while in the mid 2010s, it was a very alt-right kind of environment. But in the late 2000s and 2011, it was actually a very left-wing space. And Anonymous generally, I mean, it was politically ambiguous, but most of those people became socialists or specifically anarchists. And you can read in the work in the journalism of Barrett Brown before he was put in jail about how there, after the Stratfor hack. Stratfor being this private intelligence service, essentially, that contracts with the American intelligence services and military to do private intelligence gathering. So basically, like an arm of the state. They uncovered in those hacks and then the journalists sifting through the leaked material, basically using networks of fake accounts that to manipulate public opinion and to spread lies about people who were heavily involved, either in the Snowden affair, or in Occupy and things like that. And they call this persona management, but you probably recognize it as techniques that are identical to the botnet accounts of that were famously used by Russian intelligence and the Internet Defense Agency to try to influence the 2016 American election. And how successful they actually were is kind of open to debate, but they did attempt it, and it was the Americans, at least that I know of, who actually pioneered the techniques that the Russians later used against the Americans. And then there's a similar Chinese program, the famous, I forget how many cents it is. I think it's either 10 cents or 50 cents. I can't remember, but I think it's the 50-cent army or something like that, supposedly because you get 50 cents a post, to sit there and work for them, spreading the Chinese line on things in the international internet. And similarly Hasbara in the Israeli context. So these techniques by which intelligence services and militaries began to manipulate the internet through social media are an important component of a lot of the nuttiness that kind of explodes over the course of the 2010s, in my opinion. Although, obviously, given the fact that a lot of this stuff is covert, a lot of this lacks precise smoking guns. But there's enough of it that's out there, like this. Basically, a lot of the sources that I've listed. If you Google any of those things, you'll find real newspapers talking about them. But that's it shows that this kind of promise of freedom was starting to be diminished a little bit. Varn, you seem like you have something to add, so I don't want to keep ranting.
Oh, I just think it's interesting that we've been one of the things I've found interesting when we talk about these intelligence programs being able to manipulate the algorithms by posting, basically, and then feedback loops. We've seen dramatic changes in the stance of the official left on certain states that are totally in line with foreign interference. And I mean that from all sides, not just from the US side. I mean, and so I find it very, for all the talk about the CIA and paranoia that I hear on the left, which ironically could actually help the CIA in a weird way. If I maybe we can go into that later.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I want to go into after we talk about some of the other stuff that we're going to build on, because once we loop back around to this, I think we'll have a better vantage point. So, okay, but we kind of made a little elision that I want to make actually an apparent conscious shift, because we went from talking about this mid 2000s search engine driven kind of internet to the social media internet, but I think that it's worth thinking about why it was that social media really took off in the first place. This is my pet theory. I don't have, I haven't yet done the real legwork and kind of proving this. So feel free to object to it. But I think that you can understand the appeal of the deep appeal of social media. By thinking about what it was like before there was a Facebook, right? Because your homepage, so to speak, when you opened up your internet browser in 2005, was not Facebook because it didn't exist. It was not Twitter because it didn't exist. It was probably Google or a knockoff search engine like Google. And you would open up your browser and you would be like, what do I want to search for? And then you search for some topic and you get a list of things, and you have to consciously sift through the results of the search engine. I mean, all of you know how to use search engines, so I'm not going to dwell on this point. But the reason why this is important is because what I notice in retrospect, in my memory, I was a middle schooler and teenager through like the 2000s and the 2010s. But in my memory, what I remember is hearing over and over again in discourse about the internet, this discourse that you don't hear that much of anymore from my experience, which is the discourse of information overload. And I think that this is like a really important change, because I think that you used to hear a lot of people saying like, there's so much out there. The internet is so vast. It's so enormous, that I can't actually make sense of all the stuff that's out there. And I don't even know sometimes what I'm looking for. You had these hubs. Somebody actually pointed out in the comments that bulletin boards were social hubs. Absolutely right, because especially before the rise of Reddit, which kind of like centralized all this. Before that, it was like these these little forums for like a community around a particular video game or a community around a particular literary sphere. And it was overwhelming because you could kind of like, through your Google search results, you would click all this stuff that was not actually the thing that you were searching for, but it would take you down these digressions. And those digressions would lead you to discover these little pockets of people having conversations about things that you have no idea what they're talking about in their own private language, in their own little community. And the internet proliferated with all like thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of these little communities. That were all kind of like doing their own thing, and there was an enormous pluralism. You can still kind of get a sense of this through Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is one of the last websites that really kind of like gives you this kind of feeling of the search engine based mentality, where like, and the great thing about Wikipedia is that it's indexed in such a way that it gives you a map, right? Like you Google something on Wikipedia and then you read the article, but then there's something in the article that you don't know what it is, but it links to the article. So you click on that article, and then you click on that article, and you click on that article, and 3 hours later you emerge and you're like you went down this rabbit hole where you started out by Googling Johnny Depp, and now like hours later you're reading about like modernist dance in Russia in the 1910s or something like that. That's but on the other hand, it has a kind of like rationality to it, because there's the old joke that if you click on the first link of any Wikipedia article, like at the top of the article, like what's the first hyperlink in the description, it'll usually be some academic discipline, right? Which will take you to some other big abstraction, which will take you some other big abstraction, and within like usually in under 5 clicks you get to philosophy. That's like the old joke. Which goes to show you how these like nested categories of articles kind of like create this dense information network that nevertheless you can surf. Right? People used to talk about surfing the web, and you kind of like actively search out. And very few users actually did do this kind of active searching out of the sort that I'm talking about. But those that did were able to like experience and discover things that they never would have learned about otherwise. But for many people, it was an overwhelming experience. So what was social media? Social media was the radical simplification of this environment. It was through centralization. It was to say, you're going to have one website that you use every day. It's not even a website, it's an app, right? You're usually not even using the desktop version, you're using the phone version. And that website is going to give you a feed, right? What is a feed? I like to think, feed is funny, right? Because it's like eating. So I like to imagine a feed actually as a kind of funnel. You kind of go up like a little chick up to social media, which is like your mommy bird, and then you open your mouth, and mama bird has already chewed up all this content, and she just inserts it like a funnel down your throat. And that essentially is what social media is. It's this funnel. You have given social media a list of your preferences. You've also given social media a bunch of information about yourself, demographic information, geographic information, and of course the likes themselves are a kind of information. And then it gives you this feed, right? The funnel of information. And you only see what it chooses to feed you, right? So the algorithm has now become, it's not like there wasn't a search algorithm in Google, but the algorithms become your sole visibility. In Google, you were seeing a bunch of stuff. You were seeing more of a map of the territory of the possible places that you could go to. But in the age of social media, you only see what is brought to you by the funnel, and nothing else is displayed to you. And nor do you see like the way that the landscape as a whole is kind of laid out. So instead you get basically like this, and you know, what it feeds you is very sophisticated, because in the first instance, it feeds you things that you already like, right? So you've already clicked, I like Batman. So it's going to send you Batman things. But then it's going to keep sending you Batman things. Now, it also knows that people who like, who like Batman also tend to like all these other things. So it's going to send you those things as well, in order to get you to click on those things, and then kind of like, you know, and there's also a way in which it kind of self-creates this, because, you know, if the algorithm's doing this, then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that anyone who likes Batman is going to see these other things too. But and then there's like a third layer of it, which is and this is, you know, I actually am gonna flub this, I'm afraid, because it was a friend of mine who works at one of the social media companies explained this to me, and I'm gonna feel so silly for not getting it. Let's see. It's the stuff you like. It's the stuff that people who like the stuff that you like tend to like, and it's and then there's a third one. I think it's using your demographic profile. You know, in order to kind of like put you into a network that it then like, you know, will match like the range of your likes with the range of other people's likes or something like that. Forgive me for flubbing it. I used to have it in my head and I lost it. But anyway, point is, right, that's how the feed works. It's this kind of funnel. And what it does is that it limits your view, right? Because the centralization of all or most internet users on these websites, or at least that's the theory, right, of these websites, and the fact that these websites are structured in this kind of like top down kind of way to funnel you the information that it's going to choose to funnel to you, means that you kind of get sorted into these little boxes, and then those little boxes determine what you see. And it's simpler for you. People don't complain that much about information overload anymore, because they're not overloaded with information. They're getting exactly the same kind of information all the time, and that's all that they see. But then the limits of your box are the limits of your world. Like you no longer get to see all these kinds of all the kind of range of possibilities, or even just like the kind of overall landscape of what it's possible to see. And you know, the funny thing is that they could, right? A website like Twitter, there's tools that exist that map the networks of accounts that follow each other, like each other, and talk to each other, right? Like, so there are ways that you can visualize this, but the apps don't themselves give users visibility into those things. They preserve the map for themselves and for their own software developers, and of course for the advertisers that they sell the information to. Which is how the Cambridge Analytica thing was able to happen, where this fascist influence operation was able to happen purely through the auspices of the data that Facebook made available to people who could pay for it. And it's not that Facebook was actively trying to aid fascists, it's that they were just selling the data to the highest bidder, and it happens that you can use that data to do an influence operation. And that's what empowers these intelligence services and so on. To be able to manipulate the masses, because, they don't give us as users the tools to understand kind of like the overall layout of the environment, or the way, or the kinds of underlying logics that give us our feed, that would allow us, or at least some fraction of us, to look out, to look for alternatives, and to kind of look outside of our box and see what's there, and see if maybe we want something that we didn't initially anticipate. In other words, discovery, right? Like, it's all, a lot of this is about how you discover new things. And what social media did was radically simplify the process of discovery at the cost of basically like destroying the freedom of discovery that had existed under older systems, and creating these kinds of like centralized information funnels.
Yeah. So what I think has been interesting about these information funnels is there's been two kind of weird feedbacks that have come up for it. We've heard a lot of talk of parasociality. And one thing that these funnels have done is actually created a whole network of things that are much more ephemeral and parasocial. Um, at once, like people feel like they have relationships to content creators because of the way they're funneled to them, and because of the way that the algorithms reward ephemerality, that producing something that has an intense, kick once, it's probably a more viable medium model, but it's not going to refresh anything, right? Now, that doesn't immediately seem to kick into what you're saying with these Facebook things, but it kind of does, because what it encourages is personal branding, which is a lot better for Facebook than aggregating all these other, and it's really good for Twitter, all these other sites that were making money. So instead of now, individual creators are now dependent on them, particularly Twitter, actually, because they're not as hampered with the algorithm deadening, to get their stuff out. I mean, you can be an asshole, Twitter edgelord, and basically build a feasible podcast career off of something obscure because you have access. But what I don't think people started really paying attention to until about 3 or 4 years ago, and it came out of the Cambridge Analytica scandals, but how much it was changing people's actual behavior, and how manipulatable it was. And we know for a fact that Facebook was trying to actively manipulate people's moods, by changing whether the algorithm rewarded positive or negative feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Parasociality is a very, very complex phenomenon.
Yeah.
And
it's not new either.
It's not new, right? But it is, the new environment has definitely made it more possible. I don't think I can get into my pet theory of why parasocial relationships have become so prominent without getting into one last kind of leg of the political economy stuff, and then I promise I'll shut up about it and we'll talk about the toxic social media stuff. But because the other thing here is funding, and that I think kind of like gives us all the pieces that we need to talk about that stuff, because I was talking about the subscription model that arose as the kind of like big alternative to ad-based legacy media. This is really important because what I've been calling alt media kind of morphed in the mid 2010s, so that now basically like what used to be like alt media and indie media is now actually, I would argue, the default media that most people under 30 consume. They consume very little of like the ad revenue based centralized legacy media and what's left of them, like shows on CBS and stuff like that. And almost all media nowadays, and some of the big guys have now like adopted this because the old revenue model just completely collapsed. Like ads don't work. Nothing is funded by ads anymore. Everything is funded by subscriptions. So and now basically like that's the way that everything works. I think that the easiest way of understanding this is to look in like a really concrete situation, because a lot of people talk about like, who, are like Marxist intellectuals, we'll talk about these kinds of things in very broad terms. Like there was, like they'll talk about how like social media emerges from the incentives of capitalism in the 21st century or whatever, but like in these like very like large scale abstractions. I personally, my interpretation of what it means to be materialist is to actually look at particular mechanisms that affect, particular agents and sectors of the economy and cause them to behave in a certain way. So like, or to be really vulgar about it, the old kind of journalistic canard of like, follow the money, right? So for me, like the key thing is, how did this social media environment create a lot of the things that we're seeing? And I think that looking at funding kind of tells a whole big part of the story. if you consider like a little magazine, like Jacobin is the so-called little magazines are basically like the small intellectual quarterly magazines that as opposed to like the big glossies like the New Yorkers and Harper's. These are like, you know, smaller scale operations that nevertheless are like, you know,
we should be careful mentioning them since we just saw one implode.
right. Yes, that's
Or actually, the second one. I mean, like most of these left media ventures fail for a variety of reasons. One is, in the case of current affairs, if we're honest and look at the evidence, part of the reason why it's conversion to a workers' co-op, while something I would have supported, would probably have not worked, is that it wasn't really financially viable without Nathan Robinson's family's money.
I honestly don't know anything about that. Like I don't have it. I don't have any insight into the financial situation. That's one of the most confusing things I've actually found about the whole thing is that I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure who literally owns. I'm not really sure who literally owns the C corp.
It's owned by a board, but the treasurer is Nathan Robinson's mother. That's public record. Nathan did not pay himself fairly, as far as everyone can tell. He didn't, but it's because money was not really the concern. That was actually also good for us because it was like why current affairs actually paid above, or what would really be fair market rate, but what was above market rate for articles, as was outed by Yasmin Nair many years ago. And you know, Jacobin took a long time to be able financially to be able to pay its writers at all. You know, which it now does. But those small quarterly magazines, I'll give you an example. I paid Yasmin Nair for something from North Star. Me and Dario Kosanovic did. And it was the only person we could ever afford to pay. She didn't want to scab. We actually were not solvent after we paid her. Like we didn't even pay ourselves. Like we were all working for free and trying to pay a writer. So the one of the things about this is, I know this because I work in publishing on the side, is that the profit margins for most mid-range publications are really, really low. And they're not even that great for the big publications, but they usually have power investors that can keep things afloat and consolidate. That model doesn't work for niche cultural and political publications, because why would a major corporation want to buy Jacobin? I mean, it actually does work for book publishers, though, which is another thing.
Well, it's the sort of situation where the glossies usually have either like a rich person who literally just puts up the money, like Harper's for many years was literally just funded by, I think it was Louis Lapham and somebody else.
Yeah, Louis Lapham, and Lapham's Quarterly is also just funded by Lapham's.
Lapham is exactly. Or they use like a moneymaker business. You know, like the New Yorker for many years, and this actually changed in the 2010s, which is interesting. The New Yorker for many years tried an ad-funded revenue model, and it failed because its ads never actually brought in enough money to keep the lights on. And the New Yorker was funded for many, many years out of the profits of other Condé Nast properties. So other Condé Nast properties like Home Improvement Magazine and other magazines like that were actually huge moneymakers through, I don't even know what revenue schemes they had. Probably some kind of like affiliate marketing type situation or something like that. But those actually brought in a bunch of money, and that money subsidized, because it's all owned by the same company, the New Yorker, because basically it was a cultural objective for Condé Nast to keep the New Yorker afloat because of the cultural prestige that it brought, and because of the control, perhaps. I mean, I'm speculating here, but the control, perhaps, that through that you can exert through the influence that you can occasionally like plant stories in there. And blah 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 blah. So that tends to be the situation in the glossies. You look at the business model, and it's that. Little magazines, basically, I would argue that the subscription model has actually been very stable comparatively for little magazines, because you basically develop this loyalty. I think it's worth going through step by step briefly, because I think that this will make it really concrete for people. Let's say you want to start a little magazine, right? Like you basically put together like, the articles. You're not going to get paid. So you have like a day job, or you have some other way. You have a 9 to 5, and on evenings and weekends, you're putting together this magazine, right? You have a couple of friends who you're putting it together with, and you have all these ideas for articles. And probably, in order to really make it work, you have to have other friends outside of the magazine itself, right? You live in a city where there's a literary art scene. Let's say it's New York, or let's say it's Oakland. Let's say it's Portland, Austin, Texas. One of these cities that has like a thriving literary scene. You yourself already freelance for some of the existing left-wing magazines. You go to the book launch parties and the issue launch parties. You meet people, you schmooze, you booze, you go to the after parties. You get invited to other stuff, So now suddenly you have like a bunch of different friends, who are potentially people who want to write about the same kind of thing that you want to write about. So you have this network that you can draw on of people who will write for you, right? When you eventually sell your literary magazine, it's going to be like, probably just sent straight to subscribers. But if it is in bookstores, it's going to be in these little independent bookstores, let's say Powell's in Portland, Oregon, right? Or maybe like McNally Jackson Books in New York, that are kind of like connected with the left-wing intelligentsia. If you have like a bookseller, or the Verso Loft is another one, even though it's not a bookstore, like it's a place where people have these parties. When you have an event, right, it's going to be at those places, and those events are also fundraising events for your magazine, right? And if you spin off a book publishing outfit from the magazine outfit, because it's basically the exact, if you want to start a book publisher and you want to start a quarterly magazine, it's basically the exact same productive process, because in neither case are you actually like doing the printing yourself. You're basically creating PDFs that you design and you're sending it to some printer. And there's actually one company called Sheridan. I shit you not, this is true. You can look it up. There's a company called Sheridan, which is basically like the little magazine monopoly of printers. Like they do the printing for like all the little magazines in New York City, like all the left wing intelligentsia little magazines. Like I know that the Point uses them, and I know that I think Jacobin uses them as well, if I recall correctly. Like they all, it's like this like mid-sized company that it's kind of like the monopolistic tentacle. And I don't think it's political at all. It's just this like random printer that gives good rates. But anywho, what I'm trying to get at is that all these little institutions, the small presses, the independent bookstores, and the little magazines, they all kind of mutually reinforce each other. It's actually kind of interesting to think of it, and I don't want to overstate this point because there is competition, but not as much as you would think. Like a lot of these businesses are really just trying to get enough revenue that they can literally survive to print the next issue. Some of them graduate into the big leagues, but most of them do not. And in an environment like that, it's actually kind of better to cooperate than it is to try to like do some kind of like drastic price competition, for example, that's going to eventually run you all out of business. And as a result, there's a lot of actual like mutual support of the magazines, for each other, like in terms of literally like sharing expertise, like you should use this printer, or you should, you can do an event here. I know somebody, I can hook you up, like blah, 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 blah. So and then when you get the money itself, right, that money is coming from subscribers, and those subscribers are subscribing to you. In theory, like the official contract is that you're subscribing either for access to the online issue or to the print issue, right? And if you subscribe to the print issue, it's a higher rate, and you get the very pretty little print magazine sent to you. But really, like, you're not doing it because of that. You're doing it because you believe in this project, right? The whole thing that distinguishes like this environment from a lot of the media consumption of the 20th century is that the media consumption of the 20th century was kind of given. It was kind of given that these things, that television exists and it was made by these companies. You don't really care that much about the companies. You just want to see what's on television, right? This is very different. This is like, we want to be an alternative to television. In order to be this alternative, we need your help in order to do it, which means that you, the consumer, need to believe in the mission of this outfit enough to continually give them money in order to allow them to continue the going concern within which this productive process is taking place to produce the art. So what does that mean? It means that goodwill of the audience is key, right? Like, because like in broad strokes, your ability to say that you're actually fulfilling this like anti-capitalistic, or avant-garde art or journalistic or whatever mission that you're selling people on, you have to actually be able to sell them on the idea that you're doing that. Otherwise, they won't want to subscribe to you. Second of all, it means that there's this kind of like there's a disconnect between like actual like sales or actual clicks and the amount of money that you get. The subscriber model is not a model where you're putting out this product continually hoping that sales will go up, or putting out these articles on a website hoping that it'll get clicks and that the ads in them will get clicks, and it's only if they get the clicks at a certain rate that you get the money. The subscription is coming in regardless. It's coming in because people believe in the mission of the thing and they want it to be going on an ongoing basis. So what that means is that the little magazines or podcasts or whatever are not just doing clickbait, because clickbait is the product of a different economic model. This is actually something I get really mad about when people accuse Jacobin or Current Affairs or The Point or LA Review of Books of doing clickbait. This is actually like factually incorrect, because Gawker will do clickbait and Jezebel will do clickbait because, or BuzzFeed will do clickbait because they have an ad-based revenue model or a click-based revenue model like affiliate marketing, where the amount of money that they get is directly tied to the number of clicks. So they are constantly trying to maximize the clicks. That is not the mission of the little magazines, even economically. And I'm not talking about this as like this highfalutin idealist thing. It's that the money comes from elsewhere. The money comes from being able to convince a number of people, and that absolute number might be very small, but it's convincing some number of people, maybe 5% of the people who click on their articles is a relatively average rate, to give money continually to the magazine, because since the magazine is the only place where you can find articles like this, you want the magazine to be able to keep going. That means that you're not maximizing clicks, you're maximizing people's belief in your mission as like an institution, and also that you are a good person. Hopefully,
right, which
some
is
of
why
your
so many of these magazines are also nonprofits.
yeah,
Like and have above subscription. Like if you look at Jacobin, for example, they're a membership model as much as a subscription model, and definitely more than an advertising model. Yes, they do advertising, and that's part of, and they have to have it on margin to survive. But
yes,
that's part of its engagement model, and the click economy there is different. I agree with you, but that is why they overproduce material for the website, is to build engagement. Again, almost parasocially, but instead of with Bashkar and Kara, it's with Jacobin as a brand, as a representative of the DSA, as the
yes.
unofficial DSA organ that people actually read, as opposed to the actual DSA organ, which no one reads, even though they get it free.
Yes, that's right. I don't, that's a great point, Varn. I don't want to give people the impression that clicks don't matter. Obviously they do. Because even using the math that I just threw out, right? Like if 5% of the people who click on you, like are possible subscribers, right? Then the more absolute clicks you have, that 5% becomes larger, which means more subscribers, which means more money. So clicks are not like, something that they don't care about. It's that they're not trying to maximize clicks and willing to like distort their content grotesquely in order to get the clicks, like endless listicles, for example, or headlines like 5 reasons why Beyonce actually culturally appropriated Indian culture, or something like that. Like they're not doing that because that's not the model of like trying to get as many outrage clicks as possible. In fact, outrage probably is actually too risky, because anything that might actually like outrage the audience itself, where the outrage is directed not outwards at some enemy, but inwards at the magazine itself, like anything too provocative, for example, anything that might actually challenge the sacred cows that currently exist, that might actually be too risky, because it might create a collapse in goodwill that leads to canceled subscriptions. Cancellations are the thing that these people, well, I shouldn't say these people, because these people are my friends, right, and associates. I'm a writer, a freelance writer in the little magazine scene, and I'm an on and off literature editor for one of them, The Point, right? So like it's not like like evil capitalists, like blah 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 blah, because frankly a lot of them aren't even like making any money at all. It's just trying to keep the concern going, like so that they can do the next issue. Although obviously this gets more complicated when real money starts coming in, which we can get into too. But but basically, this is the kind of thing that they're concerned about. So if you add in the rise of social media, centralized social media as this kind of like as this funnel for content to users based on like these demographic groups that they get stuck in, and then they no longer are able to discover anything outside of that group. And you combine that with the incentives of the subscription-based model that is the basis of all new mass media. And just as a side note, it's so much the basis of like mass media that it's not just the basis of the publications, it's also increasingly the material basis for the writers. You cannot pay rent as a writer unless you are in the tier of writers who gets a book deal and enough royalties from a best-selling book that it pays your rent. And that's a very, very small tier of writers. Every single writer who's working their way up to that tier, which is like the vast majority of the writers that you read in your favorite magazines, have some other, they have some other day job, or they have some other way of, they're either independently wealthy or they're graduate students and they're living on the stipend, or professors, or they have a day job that they don't talk about because it's like their 9 to 5, right? And that's the way that they actually pay their rent. And the little payments that they get of between $100 and $1,000 for each article that they submit, that's a bonus. And writers are always agitating. I mean, now we're more class conscious than we used to be. And like, you know, you've got things like the IWW Freelancers Union, but nobody is paying rent off of this except for like a very, very small group of people who are able to just like churn out, you know, like 3 articles a month, like 4 articles a month. And usually these are not the articles that most people want to write. It's going to be for like places that are more like think piece farms. So really, most of the writers are surviving through their own independent individual versions of the subscription model. They start a Patreon just for them, and then people pay, you know, directly. So Richard Seymour, for example, has a Patreon like this, and Elizabeth Sandifer has a Patreon like this, where they write for the Patreon, and there's Patreon exclusive content that they throw out. Substack basically is the attempt to turn this into a centralized website, but before that, it was done, you know, as one variation of how you could do a Patreon. The other writers, a lot of your favorite writers are subsidized by their podcasts. Like, you know, they'll write for other places, but they have this like podcast that they do about like, you know, wrestling or something. And that podcast is what's paying their rent, that lets them write like little left-wing intelligentsia pieces about whatever, right? So this subscription model really, in a profound way that most people don't understand because they don't actually do a materialist analysis of the literary scene and the journalistic scene, is fundamentally what is undergirding this stuff. And the effective demand for these cultural products is actually kind of generated within the scene itself. And so these collaborative relationships that I'm talking about are not actually just this utopian kind of, you know, everybody getting along around the campfire singing Kumbaya. It's actually very important because if you make lots of friends in the scene who have their own platforms, like a podcast that has a fandom, then by showing up on their podcast, you might accrue some of that fandom to yourself. And 5% of that fandom, or between 1 and 5% of that fandom, is going to give you money, right? So that's why appearing on one another's shows, being published in one another's publications is so important, because it's actually the effective demand of this, the effective demand that for your existence, basically, as a writer or as a publication, is actually driven by all these other publications that you collaborate with. And the reason why you collaborate this is where you kind of have to like decide between cynicism and idealism. Part of the reason they collaborate is the idealistic reason, because there actually is a shared political project called socialism or anarchism or whatever, communism, that these people share, and so therefore like we're all kind of in it together. The other reason why, or art, if it's less political, right? But the other reason, which is the cynical reason, is because you scratch my back, I scratch yours, essentially, right? Like it's everybody helping each other out eventually means that the fans kind of like spread out to everybody, and everybody gets a little bit of money, which in a small scene like this can actually like help significantly because everybody's basically advertising for everybody else, right? Like the you can think of it that way too. It's like the if you put out a if Jacobin puts out a new book, right? It gets reviewed by all the little left-wing intelligentsia magazines and sold in like the left-wing connected bookstores and all this other stuff. That will tend to mean business for everybody. So actually, that's part of the reason I would argue materialistically or materially why these kinds of collaborations and cooperation happens.
I'm only half kidding. Porn leads the way in tech and financial development. I would say yes, but it also indicated how it was going to die. Porn fiscally collapsed in about 2013 because of aggregators and centralization hubs like Pornhub, Xhamster, etc. It completely killed the money in the industry. The response to that has been basically a Patreon model style and OnlyFans. I mean, OnlyFans is basically Patreon for adults, except now the financial pressure of the social media hubs and the banking industry is causing OnlyFans to risk insolvency to get rid of its porn, just like Tumblr did, even though it'll probably collapse the platform. It would be better for them to do that, apparently, than to risk being delisted monetarily by things like the banks. So while you're right that porn actually was the model for all this in a lot of ways, it's also kind of the hint of where things are going. And I think that's also interesting when you have the the thing you were right about, JM, is how many of us survive as writers because I wanted to be a writer. I'm now a podcaster. And a streamer. I worked in editing for much longer than podcasting. I never thought I was going to. Yes, I've been a journalist off and on for a lot part of my life. Informally, I've only once actually worked as a journalist, and it was very briefly. But, as a music reviewer, a cultural journalist, a freelancer, I've done that off and on for 20 years. For 10 years of it, to be popular, even to sell my poetry book, guys, I've had to either tour the local circuit with very little avail and sell it directly, or and ask to be paid not in royalties but in literal copies of my book so I can sell it and get and recoup full cost. Like that's where we're at. Or I've had to promote it via my unrelated podcast career.
The thing is, it's not always bad, right? Because I mean, somebody here just joked, coming up next is Varn the gamer, right? Varn with a Twitch stream. But the thing
this is on Twitch, by the way.
Oh, this is on Twitch. Okay, well, there you go. So using Twitch for its appropriate
I make no
purpose,
money for Twitch because I don't know how to do the parasocial thing, and that actually I do know how to do it. I don't have the time to do the parasocial thing and the way you have to be a monetarily successful streamer.
Right, and we're probably going to get into that next. But just I do want to before we get really pessimistic, I do want to throw one last idealistic thing out there, which is this isn't always a bad thing. I think that the idea that you could make a living as a writer is actually like a relatively recent one. Some of the most successful writers of the 19th and 20th century were able to make that work through a combination of their own personal qualities and the political economy of the publishing environment that they inherited. A lot of the greatest writers of the last 2 centuries did not make that work. Wallace Stevens, who's one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, worked as an insurance lawyer, I believe. Kafka worked for the Social Democratic workers comp insurance company.
I was going to say almost none of the modernists actually worked. They either worked as journalists or they worked completely outside of writing, with the exception of a few people like T.S. Eliot, who worked specifically in publishing of literature. But the idea of the professor writer that we know of from the mid-century onward is actually kind of rare, and the pure writer is a product of the 40s to the 80s, and that's it.
Yeah, they really I really want to emphasize that, the idea of writers who pay their rent with their book money is actually a very historically limited phenomenon. And that includes some of the greatest works of all time. It depends. It varies from period to period, but for a lot of them, you're talking either rich patrons, right? So like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, there was a patron, I forgot her name, but she was a white aristocratic woman in New York who funded most of the Harlem Renaissance writers, and they chafed under her patronage too, because she forced them. This is a big part of the history of the Harlem Renaissance, to write these kind of like self-exoticizing, performative stories about like the struggles of Black life, which you can write for a little bit, but then afterwards you get sick of it and you want to write for Black people like that, and that
right,
and
and they don't need to know about their own struggles in that way. I mean, like, so much of that is performative for white people. The Ta-Nehisi Coates problem is not new.
Absolutely. The political economy of writing has always been precarious for those who want to do work that is truly avant-garde or truly politically radical or just truly like earnest and committed in a way that the current environment doesn't allow, that the environment at any given time does not allow. So the bright side of this environment where writers are often supporting themselves with other ventures is that those other ventures get a literary, philosophical, and political spin that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Because people who wanted to do, serious intellectual essays or novels, modernist style novels or whatever, conceptual poetry, end up doing this other stuff, but they bring some of that stuff with them, right? ContraPoints is a good example, kind of like drop out of the philosophy PhD, career mill, and then ended up bringing that to YouTube and doing these like very like artsy, but then also like philosophical type YouTube videos that ended up like taking off. And obviously a lot of people have problems with ContraPoints for different reasons. Like I don't want to. I like her a lot, but like I know that people have problems with her. It's not an endorsement. It's just a showing like the kinds of possibilities that might exist for the enrichment of the cultural scene through this kind of like necessary cross-pollination between the different art forms that the political economy of art is making possible. However, all of that optimism aside, there is good reason to be pessimistic, because a lot of these material structures that Varn and I have been talking about create these absolutely hideous incentives that I would argue account for much of the unpleasantness that currently exists, that all of you guys complain about. And I know that you guys complain about it because I see you in the comments of Varn streams or on Leftbook or on Twitter complaining about it. And I think that if you want to understand what's causing it, you have to look at these underlying structures. For example, we talked about echo chambers, right? What are the actual material consequences of echo chambers, or of funnels? Sorry, I just spoiled it. Or the funnel, the social media funnel, right? What is one of the material superstructural consequences of the material underlying structure of a social media funnel? Well, if the funnel approach is the way that everything happens nowadays and the way that people discover media, then it creates echo chambers, right? Little pockets of total political and cultural and everything else identity agreement where like there's a party line that no one person establishes, but that is kind of like the initial consensus of the group. And then any straying outside of that party line, gets you socially exiled from the group. And you also are all getting funneled, and this kind of like perpetuates that behavior. You're all getting funneled the same diet of information. It's what happens when people who are in the same funnel communicate with each other, and then as a result of the funnel cease to communicate with anyone else. And this happens in there's echo chambers of every possible and conceivable political stance, and there's also aesthetic stances and all these other things, and people become trapped in it and they become unable to see outside of it. Then it gets worse, because then think about how those echo chambers actually interact. And this varies based on the platform, but this is especially true on Twitter. Okay? Twitter. How do you grow an account on Twitter? Some of you know this and some of you don't. On Twitter, the fastest way to grow an account is picking fights with bigger accounts. They post something, and then you post either as a quote tweet or as a reply some vicious, witty, obnoxious, hilarious, memeified response basically indicating that this other person is an idiot. And you have like 5 followers and this person has like 5 million, right? What happens? Well, especially if they reply to you, that means that anybody who follows them has a pretty good chance of seeing your post because they'll see they'll see their reply to your post. And then what happens is essentially that there's this magical, horrible feedback loop that gets started because basically they already had a bunch of people. If you have 5 million followers, those followers are not all fans. That's 5 million people who see you on a regular basis. That includes people who love you and believe in your mission or ideals or aesthetic or whatever. And it's also like a bunch of people who hate you and they hate follow you. So their haters become your fans, and if you dunk on them in a way that makes it so that, like, you come off as the, at least to the haters, as like the you got the better of this bigger account, a bunch of people will follow you. And in fact, the more that they engage with you and the more that they attack you and that you reply, the more people will see it, and some percentage of those people who see it are going to follow you as a result. And this is how you grow accounts on Twitter. This antagonistic conflict as engagement is what I call it. Basically, like, leads to greater engagement for your account because you sought conflict with a bigger account. And here's what's worse: not only do their haters become your fans, but their fans become your haters. And this seems like it would be a bad thing because most people don't want to be hated, but
it gets Twitter engagement up.
Exactly. So any narcissist knows that all news is good news. Like, it's if people are talking about you, then it means that even if they hate you, it doesn't matter what they say. It means that people are talking about you. And this is it turns out that this kind of narcissistic attitude is actually a very good psychology to have if you want to become famous, and Twitter literally gamifies this, literally turns this into a mechanism for how it allocates eyeballs in its algorithm, because their haters will constantly post about you as a result of the fact that you antagonized. So in the situation where you attack the bigger account, their fans become your haters, and they will constantly post about you because you once antagonized the person who they are a fan of. And this drives engagement. Now, it may not be very pleasant engagement. It may be people quote tweeting everything that you do. It might be people stalking you obsessively and taking screenshots and sharing it in group chats, in order to try to, like, find something that they can use to destroy you later on or whatever. But it's eyeballs. And those eyeballs will eventually cause your account to show up on more people's screens, cause more people to follow you, which causes you to show up on more people's screens, and so on and so forth. So what does that mean? It means that structurally, opposite sides of any given conflict on social media, and this includes political conflicts, cultural conflicts, aesthetic conflicts, aesthetic fandoms of people who are having a literary feud, whatever. Or geopolitical sides in, like, a literal conflict like the Syrian civil war, right? Like, opposite sides of a conflict are in their little echo chambers, but because of the conflict as engagement mechanism, those echo chambers interrelate to each other. And not only do they interrelate, they actually feed off of each other.
They're mutually constitutive identities. Like, they create each other. And
yes.
And their insanities actually infect the other side. They're mutually dependent on each other. I mean, it's actually the very first post you saw on this channel during my hiatus over at Zero was me talking about exactly that tendency and how politically this is actually, it's great for a media career, kind of. It does have a tendency to collapse fast because antagonistic identity groups that are based on somewhat superficial values can just run out of steam very quickly and deflate like a souffle. I used to talk to Jason Myles over This Is Revolution. He calls it the rat beef model, and he says it pays off fast, but it's super risky as a model because it can collapse super fast. And we see that. I mean, we think about bread tubers who are huge, who just disappeared. The other thing is that it encourages behavior and kinds of scrutinies on personal life that invite really personally disastrous behavior.
Yes.
And for that to be made public too, often by the people involved in ways that don't really help anyone. So you see these media careers build and fall really quickly, and you see, if you look under the hood, a lot of those people have engaged in personally risky, very disastrous, amoral behavior, partly fed on by a state of exemption from their own fandom, which then falls apart the moment that it's exposed due to one of these mutually constitutive feuds. I mean, that's why, like, I don't engage in like cancel culture talk, because, for example, I don't want to defend a lot of that stuff because I don't think a lot of that stuff is actually pro-social behavior. And there are a lot of liberals who are twisting their minds to be like, well, no, cancel culture is actually good. It's a sign we're collectively policing ourselves, and that's a sign of a healthy community. Sure, whatever, lie to yourself all you want.
Right.
But it's also not that big a deal because the entire media apparatus is based on these mutually constitutive hate. And for the people who really matter, canceling actually helps reinforce them with their base, with their base demographic group. It actually doesn't. It's just a media strategy. You can literally. I hate to like use this on Glenn Greenwald and for people who believe in facts and logics or whatever, but you can see this in Glenn Greenwald's media engagement strategy, which was 10 years ago, deliberately inclusive of leftist, rightist elements, of, whatever. He talked to anybody. And now, since he's got onto Substack, it's deliberately exclusive. But what's
Absolutely.
funny is like the official mediators of like official media need him to do it so they can complain about him to also maintain their own relevancy. So
Right.
like them complaining about Substack is part of their growth model.
Yes.
And how they maintain any semblance of legitimacy when they've seemingly lost it as glossies, who pivot at the wind.
And I think another cultural consequence of the mutually co-constitutive antagonism of echo chambers that engage in conflict as engagement. God, that's a whole bunch of my little buzzwords, but hopefully it's clear because I explained it. Another cultural consequence of this, I would argue, is the feeling of like endless, exhausting conflict that you see in a lot of these like spaces. And also the feeling of like stuck culture. This is a term I've heard a lot more of in recent years. Actually, in the last 6 months, I would say, I hear a lot of complaints about stuck culture. The feeling that like, culture has stopped evolving after a certain point. And people argue about that. Some people say it hasn't evolved since the 90s, which I think is ridiculous and preposterous. But, some people, I think what people are really talking about is the feeling of stuckness in cultural production in the last like 5 years. And I would argue that a great deal of stuck culture comes from like debates, like cultural, social, aesthetic, whatever debates, where the sides organize themselves into these like mutually antagonistic and therefore mutually reinforcing echo chambers that have remained static, right? Because it's actually, in this kind of structural material sense, it is actually like more beneficial unconsciously behind the backs of the participants themselves for both sides, for that to remain just like a constant conflict that just doesn't evolve and that is just like the exact same talking points over and over and over again, dunking on each other forever and ever. It is actually better for the social media engagement and therefore the followers and therefore the 5% of the followers who give money, of everyone involved in that stupid antagonism, for that to just remain the same forever and ever, than for somebody to break the deadlock with a new idea that allows you to either like overcome the limitations of both sides or to see the thing from a fresh point of view. Because especially if that person is, their individual audience or that publication's individual audience is smaller than the aggregate audiences of those two echo chambers, they'll just be kicked out because they don't fit into either one, so they just get swept away. So there's this a lot of stuck culture, I would argue, actually derives from these social media incentives. I want to move on a little from this because there's more, and I think that this is something that gets to what Varn was talking about with cancel culture and the way that cancel culture actually works, as opposed to the imaginary way that people often have in their heads for how it works. You know, another consequence of this media environment that I'm talking about, and this is not just the social media echo chamber funnel effect, it's also the thing that I was talking about before about collaboration, like the conscious collaboration of media, where like the effective demand is generated from everybody kind of showing up as free advertising in each other's publications and broadcasts in order to kind of like create more hype for the scene as a whole and bring everybody up. That has a very dark side because it encourages groupthink. Everybody knows the idea of groupthink from Orwell, who famously invented the thought police, who come and arrest you for even just saying out loud in front of a telescreen, the wrong think that goes against the ideology of the totalitarian state or whatever. And I think a lot of people have had this experience of, whatever the ideology of the echo chamber that social media has sorted them into, they oftentimes feel like there's a thought police there, for if they have any kind of dissenting view. Why does that happen? I would argue that it happened because the alt media funding model, although it solved the problems of artistic freedom and pluralism, I would argue, I would really argue that the problem that we had in the 20th century, when the age of media oligopolies, right, that these gatekeepers fundamentally controlled what could show up on the screens, and the only thing that most people saw was what showed up on the screens. It crowded out everything else. That problem has been solved because of the crowdfunding model and the cooperative model. I think that is an over and done with problem. So there is now this room for artistic freedom and pluralism, sort of, but that's not all the problems that a media environment can have. Profit and centralization might be the enemies of art, but ultimately, so too is groupthink. And arguably, the new media environment exacerbates groupthink, because if you have this cooperative and collaborative rather than competitive environment, and here I'm really thinking of left-wing kind of alternative media as my model, this means that if you have a cult belief that takes over the informal peer network of some cluster. It doesn't even have to be the whole thing, but just some cluster of the alt media institutions, right? The editorial boards of some of the more prominent magazines, or the an organization that a lot of the people are a part of, or whatever. That cult belief, through its just informal spread, because cult beliefs can spread and a whole town can go crazy, for a couple of years, and then eventually it kind of fizzles out if it's just an isolated town. But remember that we're talking about these very densely networked and geographically dispersed information networks that exist as a result of the internet. So if a cult belief starts to spread within this network of institutions that are basically just an informal network of people who are collaborating, within, let's say, the left-wing little magazines or the left-wing podcasts or BreadTube or whatever, then if that belief spreads to, say, all the assistant editors of a whole generation of left-wing little magazines, then you could get blacklisted all at once from an entire scene just for disagreeing with that idea. And this has nothing to do, this is what's important for people to internalize, and Marxists may not like this, but this doesn't actually have to do with capitalism per se. This doesn't actually have to do with the existence of the wages system and private ownership over the means of production and the MCMC prime and the MCM prime circuit. That's not really what's going on. It's that this particular highly networked institutional structure, combined with the way it's not that capitalism has nothing to do with it, but it's it's not the primary thing that's causing it.
It doesn't work on a commodity basis in the same way. Your branding is not a commodity in the sense of a capitalist commodity, and it also doesn't really work on compelled rents or advertising on the same way. It works on parasocial engagement and buskering and concentrated pools of that. So it's basically you can hoard social capital and use it and kind of monetize it, but you could do it even in a para-capitalist context like this. You wouldn't need capitalism for this to happen. This is a more basic social dynamic.
And I would even go further. If we lived in a socialist society of one sort or another, where social media was owned, whether by the state or by a cooperative or whatever, if the social media websites were set up in a similar enough way to the way that they're set up now, which, there's reasons why they might be, especially if it's nationalized and controlled by the state, I would argue, because a lot of the things that we were talking about before about only the back end having the map and everybody else just having the funnel would be very convenient if the state if they controlled it, for authoritarian purposes. But if it had the same design and it was all like not for profit and not owned by private capitalists and all this other stuff, it would have all the same problems, because that raises more fundamental questions. Not so much like somebody asked, like, would we still have social media in a stateless, moneyless society? That kind of like implies that there's one opinion that you can have in a stateless, moneyless society about whether an institution like this should exist. I think that the more fundamental question is, like, should we, like, you have to make decisions, and people are making decisions. It's just that right now the people making those decisions are capitalists and politicians in the state. But like, even if we got rid of all those people, like, and had this like truly democratic society or whatever, decisions would still have to be made about whether we actually want to have these institutions, and if we do, how would we want them to be structured? And that is, and part of the danger of how they're structured right now, and they are structured like this for reasons that benefit capitalists in the state, but it's also not obvious that getting rid of capitalists in the state will solve this problem, because everything that I'm talking about basically has to do with the way that the a highly networked, like, social network, and I'm not talking about like the website, I'm talking about the people on the website, like a highly networked social network of peers. Ideas can spread very rapidly in that network, but if an idea spreads and then there's dissent to that idea, but there's no outside of that network in terms of like, publication opportunities, suddenly you can have like whole discourses just shut out, and you don't even need media oligopolies or state media in order to do it. So this is a big problem for cultural producers. Whereas before, cultural producers were constrained by the gatekeepers, right? The veto power of the corporate suits over the creatives, and the fact that there was nowhere else to go that had mass reach besides like the telescreens. Now they're constrained by whether or not they're in the cool kids club of existing media producers, which would allow them to, it affects how much they'll platform you on their shows and promote your work, and therefore how much money you can get to reproduce your work as an activity. By helping you get engagement among their fandoms. Now, a lot of people who are watching probably are already putting the pieces together, and they know that what I'm talking about is the institutional environment which allowed for the initial rise of what is often called wokeness. Although I personally don't like calling it wokeness, because I think that that's very imprecise. I think it's specifically like an ideology that I call identitarianism, which is not any advocacy for identity-based politics, because as we know, there's all sorts of struggles that occur that have to be advocated for on the basis of some identity, because it affects that identity and not necessarily everybody else. Like LGBT struggles, for example, or feminism, or or the specific forms of oppression and exploitation that arise, due to the legacy of slavery among Black people in the United States. Like, trying to reduce everything to the so-called universal class issues will tend to flatten a lot of the specific needs of specific parts of the working class in a way that doesn't really make that much sense. However, there's this set of dogmas that have emerged around identity struggles, such as the idea that, like, only somebody from a particular identity can speak to, what is good for that identity, and anybody else having any kind of opinion on it, that disagrees with them is basically oppressing them, and anybody from the same identity who disagrees with them is basically like a fake, and not legitimate version, because they're the only true representative that speaks for everybody with the identity, and common shared understandings of people from different identity groupings are impossible, because there's like a hard epistemological break that makes it impossible to actually understand each other, like, beyond the identities that we inherit. and all these kinds of, and the idea of culture as like the property of an identity, all these kinds of dogmas that have nothing to do with the struggle, for example, against like, you know, mass unemployment in the inner city, or against, or for, you know, trans people's right to access you know, the medical procedures that they need, and all this other stuff, like all these like religious theological dogmas that have emerged from a certain kind of like academic milieu have kind of spread outside of that milieu into the activist milieu, and then into like, you know, the brains of the assistant editors at a bunch of prominent magazines. And that basically places a whole lot of things that aren't even bad off limits to even discuss or talk about, and also like paralyzes our ideas. It's a very oppressive and, you know, constipating kind of feeling. That a lot of writers feel really shackled by. And I can understand the frustration about it, and I share that frustration myself. I've actually taken a lot of heat for writing about identity politics in a critical way since like 2015. But what I think a lot of people don't understand is that like wokeness or identitarianism is not unique. Like it is the first and perhaps the most prominent for now of the kinds of like identity or intellectual cults that have kind of like taken over like the new media environment. But there are actually several of them, or perhaps a better way of thinking about it would be like several different scenes, most of which are kind of gripped by dogmas as rigid as that of identitarianism. Like, it's not that identitarianism is unique. I mean, there are certain ways in which it's become unique because it has this like outsized influence in a very small sphere that is important to cultural producers. But honestly, there's actually a lot of these like dogmatic and toxic and closed off scenes. You know, that operate on very similar incentives and to have a similar role in kind of like constipating the development of new ideas, you know, because of these combination of social media infrastructure that we're talking about. And I don't know if you want to talk about. I wrote in my notes a couple of these scenes, but I've been going on for a while, so I don't know if we want to get into them.
Let's talk a little bit about these specific scenes. What are the scenes that you think that are proliferating right now?
So this is. I'll preface this by saying that like this is a very informal sketch, and I'm kind of using Twitter as like a shorthand. But you know, like different sectors of Twitter. And somebody in the comments complained before, like, well, you know, how much of this is like, you know, is just specific to Twitter? Well, a lot of it is specific to Twitter, but Twitter is important because the intelligentsia and the Beltway journalists and the official institutions um, are all on Twitter, and the artists. So a lot of cultural producers actually, to promote their work, primarily depend upon Twitter, and therefore Twitter's incentives have an outsized influence on cultural production. That's a situation that I'm actually very unhappy about. I don't like that. I don't like Twitter as a platform. I don't like what it does to me as a writer, and I've seen it destroy other writers completely and utterly. Multiple ones, not just one.
But Facebook is no longer a viable platform. It's far more censorious, and
absolutely.
And there's, I know it's not cool to admit how censorious Facebook has gotten in the last 3 years, but it's really easy to tick off its blind idiot algorithm in a way that Twitter really kind of is a free for all unless you go really, really far.
Right.
And it is largely apolitical in the way it moderates. And you can't say that for Facebook. Facebook is always correcting one way or the other, trying to moderate it and balancing out by counter moderating another group. It has a very politicized moderation process, even though it's largely an idiot algorithm that moderates it. You can see this in the way that like the way they hedge their bets on the way they handle Trump, the way as soon as they take off a right-wing group, they'll usually take off 3 smaller left-wing ones. And so it's not very useful anymore. Plus, there's the whole thing I talked about, the pay-to-play element, which Twitter has not embraced nearly as much. But Twitter is deleterious. Its culture actually does the exact that has it even more than Facebook has the mutual hate sharing constituency. This was something that I started noticing many years ago. And the way like this actually before I was even really dealing with the left, but when I was coming out of my conservative phase, I was watching the way like conspiracy groups and skeptics groups and atheist groups and religious groups were like totally doing this. And it actually is a good model for what we see now, except that it assumes a secular guise. I say assumes because a lot of this stuff is it's not really religious, and it's kind of an abusive language to call it so, but it follows the same kind of ideological and identity in a personal sense, not in an identitarian sense. Um, uh, Patterns of engagement and development.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which this can be reduced to social media, because honestly, what social media is doing is that its algorithms are hijacking. Some people are not going to like this, but it's hijacking more or less transcultural and transhistorical aspects of human sociality and behavior. Like the in-group out-group dynamics are very well understood and very well documented in basically all historical situations at this point. Like, it's one of the few truly solid things that has survived the replication crisis in psychology, and that science is actually what a lot of the social media companies are using in order to manipulate people through their algorithms. So I think that part of, like,
it is designed basically to give people what they want in a very almost reptile brain way. We're getting asked a question that maybe we should address before I let you pivot to the next thing. Should we,
sure.
as leftists under capitalism, ideally want a totally free social media or not, or with a world where social media is more relevant? I think we'd want a world where social media is more relevant, but if it's not, we want it free, because of just power differentials,
Yeah.
um, like the fact that um, if a leftist loses their social media platform, they actually probably do have less options than rightists do. And they definitely have less independent sponsorship. Um, there's multiple reasons for that. Some of that's money. I will say, as we've been kind of hinting, left has patronage too, and we're kind of not honest about it, and we always have. Um, so what you'd want is more of a decoupling between platforms and identity. But let's pivot back to what we were going to talk about. I just wanted to address that while I saw it before I just let it bypass me.
I would also just add, before pivoting, the main thing is that it's something that we should discuss.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the main thing is that this is something that is a decision that, I mean, for me, socialism means the democratization of the economy. So it's something that socialists would need to discuss and come up with different schemes and openly discuss the different schemes and the benefits and the costs of each one and the risks of each one. And then maybe somebody comes up with a synthesis of them, or somebody comes up with another one that, there needs to be a debate and a conversation and discourse for deciding collectively what we want to do with this technology. And I think that this is true of, like, a lot of things where, like, we have allowed these institutional structures to so warp the generation of our ideas that we are almost no longer even capable of having these kinds of, like, practical hands-on debates about, like, okay, so if we did seize the means of communication, what would we do with them? And a lot of people are more willing to just kind of, like, endlessly doom post about this stuff than actually think through what alternatives might look like. And I think that that's kind of like a major epistemic obstacle. In some ways, I feel like this whole scene is, and we'll get back to this, I think, by the end. The whole left-wing scene is so much more closed than it was in 2011. In 2011, everything felt possible in a way. Things were really opened up in terms of the range of possibilities. And now I feel like it's kind of stagnated into these kinds of, like, fixed programs that, are very difficult to move beyond and think through in new ways. But anywho, the scenes, right? Because this will figure into a lot of the stuff that we say. If you imagine Twitter as, like, this map, you'll find that the map has these little dense pockets where the networks of accounts that are interlinked and having these discussions, and those accounts are the accounts of writers, the accounts of podcasts, the accounts of YouTube personalities, and so on, publications, form these little factions. And I think it's important to, like, think through the factions. This is my working model. This is not objective truth, kind of, like, handed down from the tablets from on high. This is just my kind of working mental model of how these things work. So feel free to, all of you will shout at me for how this is all wrong. But if you imagine Twitter as a map, I see one section of it as, like, Rose Twitter, right? The socialists, the people with the little rose emojis in their profiles, or variations thereof, right? So that's going to be like your DSA establishment, Boss Caucus people, your Jacobin and current affairs personalities and their fandoms. It's going to involve libertarian socialists and anarchists. That's kind of black flag Twitter, but it's basically all kind of imbricated in rose Twitter. It's going to involve your red flag Twitter, your Leninists or communists, lefty academics and journalisms and their particular fandoms, Chapo Trap House and the extended kind of podcast universe that's emerged from it. And I'm not just talking about like actual spin-offs of Chapo. I'm talking about like everybody wanting to start their own Chapo, right? And all their fandoms are going to be on there.
Yeah, all the Michael Brooks fandoms too, and the
right, exactly, right. And then like theory Twitter, like the weirdo accounts that are really into like value form theory and stuff. And that last one actually has some overlap with the next faction I'm going to talk about, which is Stupid Poll. And I'm using Stupid Poll as a kind of metonym because Stupid Poll, it really is a subreddit, but I'm using the subreddit as a metonym for this larger phenomenon of the kind of like the faction of the left that has made its like sole and exclusive priority like opposition to identitarianism to the point of like, in my opinion, radically distorting their own left-wing commitments and kind of like becoming deranged from it and just as dogmatic and authoritarian and actually kind of like crypto-fascist, in my view.
Well, I mean, they turn workerism into an identity as opposed to a strategy or a way of understanding relations. And they also tend to reify, quote, working class culture, but by that they mean white blue collar culture from about 1950, and
right.
It's not actually a thing that exists in the same way anymore, and you can tell that they don't really know it, that it's largely affectations by interacting with them. You have Stupid Poll, you have the quote, the more intellectually sponsored versions of this, like the Bellows and
right,
What's Left crowd.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I'm adjacent to that crowd. I mean, I was seen as both part of actually 3 of those sub communities, and I didn't really feel like I belonged to any of them. But I saw that get real. I saw Stupid Poll get grosser and grosser, particularly after Bernie lost. And
absolutely,
I also saw, conversely, a lot of the people fighting them becoming more and more standard fucking even right-wing Democrats. Like I saw former Marxist groups like criticizing Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan.
Total
like, wacky shit.
There's total derangement happening in all directions. I completely agree on all those counts. I would second all those observations. I too was kind of adjacent to Stupid Poll for a while because I was a left-wing writer who openly criticized identitarianism. I certainly don't brag about this anymore, but even when it was a good thing, I didn't really brag about it. But I did one of the first sympathetic reviews for Nagel that was published in the United States.
I literally was one of the votes that published the book, even though I had criticisms of it. So yeah,
exactly.
I can't deny my role in that.
Like in these times, and you can read it, and you'll note that in my review, I treat it as what it was in my view, which was an interesting book about fascism primarily, from the point of view of a journalist who had respectively covered like incel mass murderers and stuff in like the Bafler and Jacobin, and that's most of what that book was. But it just happened to include a chapter that was critical of identity politics and kind of said that the identity politics of the left and the identity politics of the right mutually reinforce each other online, and that's basically,
Which
basically
I thought
true.
Was true, although.
But she's become the victim of that though in some ways, because she's not the victim, I would say she's a
perpetuator.
She's a perpetuator. Yes, right. Because what happened with her is that she went totally off the deep end, and this is happening with a lot of the Stupid Poll writers, and basically is so opposed to identitarianism that even the suggestion, right, that that identities that are not like traditional sexual identities have or gender identities have like resonance within the working class. She basically dismisses that as a slander. Like all the working class are like super trad. The working class is primarily white and hates immigration, and the idea that you would campaign for less immigration restrictions is basically like a concession to the capitalist centrists. And the whole idea that like immigrants suppress wages rather than like capitalists who set lower wages for immigrants because immigrants don't have protections if they're undocumented, like all that stuff, right? Like she basically went like so hardline in that direction that she ended up publishing in like American Affairs, which, as we're going to get into, is kind of like this like crypto fascist journal.
I wouldn't throw crypto fascists at them, but I would say they're pernicious as fuck and they're right wing as fuck. I'm a little bit more hesitant to call people fascist because there's always the word game you can play with that fucking word.
Well, that's true. I'll make an argument for that when I get to them, but at the very least, like hard right wing with a lot of capitalist money behind them, trying to.
A former neoconservative who became an enlightened nationalist is the main guy, and he wrote on corporatism. And by corporatism, we do not mean like rule of corporations. We mean something like integralism or something that is fascist adjacent historically, or
economic planning that reconciles the classes and ends the class struggle, because
it's
the
class
right people
collaboration is class collaboration is nationalism.
But to just finish the factions really quick, right? So stupid Paul, who is that really? Or the post left, right? It's like people like the Amy Therese, the Red Scare fandom, and the Sean McCarthy fandom. It's publications like The Bellows and Unheard, and there's a pipeline for it of people who were like,
and there's money for it too, actually. But yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about the money, but but there's definitely a pipeline of people who were like, involved in like DSA activism, and then like, got pissed off at identitarians and their excesses, and so like went into this mentality instead. But the problem
for example, a lot of them get right wing, not the American ones, but like Malcolm Swayuna, who's always touring around when NACO, gets right wing think tank money.
Okay. And the Spiked people got Coke money, I believe, right?
Yeah, there's although Spiked is Spiked. My former affiliates over at Platypus are much longer and have much weirder histories, and I wouldn't call them part of the post left.
Right.
In some ways, the post left mirrors what they did first. But because they were doing that, way before 2019.
Right.
There's there's always been a lot of money to be a leftist who takes right-wing politics. I mean, that's like Christina Hoff Sommers' business model for like 30 years.
That's certainly true. Yes. Yeah. No. Right. And there's a whole market of I actually find George Orwell to have been one of the most principled writers of the 20th century in terms of. No, I do. I know, and a lot of people have like the idea that he was like a snitch and all this other stuff, which I think is a slander because it's not really what that list was. But But like, I find him to be generally like kind of an exemplar for how to navigate a lot of these like contradictions. And he wrote about it too in some of his better essays about being a writer. But wait, where the fuck was I going with Orwell? What was it that you just said?
I don't know where you were going with Orwell.
There was a specific association that came from what you just said. What was it that you just said before this? God, I'm out of it today. I need more coffee. Fuck, what was it? It was the money that came out of it. There was something I was gonna do about him. Well, whatever.
We have his whole pernicious, his relationship to the state governmental apparatus is something that like everybody has to reconcile about him. And I'm not just talking about that list. I'm also talking about the fact that
BBC propaganda doing the
BBC propaganda, and was anti-fascist that like he got mad at anti-imperialists for not being anti-fascist enough, even though it wasn't totally in their own interest.
But he shifted too, because like he was actually taking the ultra left position against World War II, like well into the late 30s until he like flip-flopped on that and then decided. So it's not. So I don't think that you can call him a BBC shill if he's saying that.
No, I don't think he was a shill. I think his positions are far more complicated than are let on. I also think we can neither take the line that he was, necessarily like turning people into MI5, nor was it just a list to the BBC that was anti-Stalinist, because he also turned in people like Charlie Chaplin and Isaac Dercher. So like it's a
but it was a list about like who to have on this program. Like, right, it wasn't, but like,
it had ties to British intelligence.
Which he didn't know about.
What,
I mean,
okay, that's the debatable point. We don't know if he knew about it because he used to work for BBC propaganda. And I don't say this. I mean, like, I say this as a person. I know Orwell's work backwards, forwards, and sideways, and like it. And when leftists attack him because like he thought socialists just went to power and were evil, which I literally saw on Twitter from someone I normally respect the other day. Which is why this is a fresh thing for me, where I'm like, I've already rehashed this recently. I think that we have to look at the context in which he wrote in, but I also think we have to be honest that Orwell, like a lot of people, went from ultra left to jingoistic positions fairly quickly.
Oh yeah, as a result of his influence. I would say as a result of the way that his work was co-opted rather than the way that his work was intended, but that's a different... Why the hell did I get onto Orwell? It was a whole thing that I was going to do that was actually like novel rather than getting into the old Orwell debates. And I can't even remember what it was, which goes to show you that I'm that I'm a terrible interviewee and you made a terrible mistake. Anyway, forget that because I forgot the point that I was going to make. Just to wrap up the groups, right? So okay, so Stupid Pull has like this kind of red brown funnel into the fasci sphere. Then there's like the intellectual dark web, which oftentimes gets associated with the fash, but I'm actually going to do what Varn did with American Affairs. I don't actually think that those guys are fascists. This is people like Conceptual James, Brett Weinstein, Wesley Yang, and their fandoms, magazines
They're
like
not
Aereo
principled
and
enough to be fascist. But go ahead.
yeah, the detritus of the Jordan Peterson crowd. You know, this is kind of like, I actually think that a lot of these people are kind of like neo-centrist Twitter, because a lot of them actually, like, you know, Wesley Yang, for example, was like published in like left-wing magazines all through the 2000s and 2010s, and was kind of like vaguely left of center until they had this usually like this disillusioning experience of some sort or another with identitarianism, and actually like sometimes sincerely disillusioning experiences with this horrible kind of identitarian madness that happened sometimes on certain campuses. And then kind of like because of that made like criticizing it like their central brand. And it just so happens that like criticizing identitarianism as like the noxious, toxic, you know, master problem that accounts for the total destruction of culture, and identifying identitarianism with the left, anything to the left of the Democrats, is actually this like very kind of profitable thing that a lot of people will give you money in order to do.
Right, but it also feeds into like Judeo-Bolshevik propaganda. But instead of Judeo, insert whatever minority you want to there.
Right. It's like cultural Marxist, you know, conspiracy theory and all this other stuff, and or the successor ideology, which is Wesley Yang's version, and all this and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing, I think, is that it's a very bizarre relationship with the fascists, because on the one hand, the IDW people, and this is especially true of Quillette, some of them are crypto fash, I would argue. Like, they basically are using this kind of like culture war critique of identitarianism as a way of sneaking in certain things through the back door. Like, you know, the doing like these kinds of like critiques of oftentimes, in my view, unfounded, of like, you know, trans people, and then sneaking in through the back door the fact that like biological truths about sex mean that like 1950s like, you know, household is like, you know, basically like inscribed in our DNA as an inevitability, and anybody who tries to defy it will destroy the foundations of culture, right? Like, or even more insidiously, and that's saying something because that's a very insidious narrative. There's also the flirtations with like the race and IQ stuff that the fash are the ones who like really like, you know, blow that up and discuss it like all the time. But the IDW people kind of like, a lot of them, especially in Quillette, which is actively written about this, like will kind of like circle around it as like the forbidden truth that can't be discussed because the wokies will like, you know, destroy you if you try. That is actually the secret truth that means that like, you know, unfortunately, you know, right-wing solutions are the only ones that are possible given this horrible limitation. And it's all bullshit junk science in my opinion. And there's a lot of actually good scientific refutations of it. But, you know, because there is basically self-imposed censorship on the discussion of this as well as a lot of other topics, the actual refutation scientifically of that stuff is very difficult to actually like publish in left-wing spaces.
I actually did once and got called a race realist for it. Like I published stuff on genetic variance and genetic drift and how like race, particularly in the concepts of race as used in our cultural linguistic model, but even in terms of like white black issues and difference in mitochondrial DNA, do not overlap at all. And any anthropologist who studies genetics knows it. And you will occasionally meet geneticists who kind of will hedge around that by talking about how race is a valid proxy for a genetic drift in geography. But then they'll have to admit that, like, oh well, yeah, but Black Africans in their terms would have more genetic diversity amongst themselves than they do amongst all other human currently existing hominids, which is basically humans. You know, that there is no, like, that there's more likely to be genetic identification between me and a Kenyan than between a Kenyan and maybe a Kalahari Bushman. And I published this, and I got told by members of the left that the fact that I put any credence into genetic at all was giving too much to race science. And I was like, I don't know, as a person who's educated specifically in anthropology, I don't even, as part of my undergrad, I don't have graduate work in it. But who is educated in anthropology, specifically physical anthropology, not cultural, I have no idea what to do with that, because I'm like, if you say genetics don't matter, then I literally don't know what to make of fucking medicine.
Right,
but
and it's
I
also,
can tell you
it's
that it
also
doesn't lead to
unnecessary.
anything racial.
Right, exactly. That's the thing. Like, a lot of the racists are actually, in a way, hiding behind the censorship, because if the censorship didn't exist, it would be quite possible to make all sorts of arguments about whether it's about, like, the incoherence of the continental races as, like, a coherent genetic population that tells you anything about, the people in them, as opposed to, like, ancestry, which is much more small scale and also much more intermingled than the racists want to talk about. Or if you talk about, like, the timelines in which IQs rise, don't necessarily match the like, purely socially constructed account of intelligence, but they also don't match the genetic determinist account of intelligence, because you have a, like, standard deviation increase in IQ from one generation to the next when a country industrializes, and that couldn't possibly be because of a change in the gene pool, right? So what the hell was that? How do the sons and daughters and
Or how, like, just
children
moving from, like, a peaceful area to a wartime area, or vice versa, drop your IQ by 50
Absolutely,
right.
absolutely, yeah. Especially if it happened early in your childhood, right? Like, it's like this absolutely foolish, like, idiotic notion of, like, the inherent aristocracy of whether it's, like, I mean, because it varies too, like, who the race and IQ people want to be rah 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 for. Initially, it was like, the Teutonic Aryan white people or whatever. The neo-reactionaries kind of added in East Asian populations, which is very funny, because in the turn of the 20th century, when the kind of, like, initial biological racists were writing, none of those countries except Japan had industrialized, and actually, like, people from China and other countries were seen as, like, the mongoloid stereotype was actually, like, a low IQ, like, bad skull shape that makes you dumb kind of stereotype. And now the neo-reactionaries kind of, like, add them into the Aryan race because they industrialize. It turns out that industrializing makes racists think that you're a human being, which kind of should show you, it's same thing with the Irish, similar story. So it kind of should show you what the trajectory of the truth seems to be, that this has happened a couple times, and the races keep having to revise, who's in the master race and who's not, based on countries that successfully industrialized. So yeah, there's all sorts of things that you can talk about, but it's very difficult to talk about them because of the censorship that exists on the topic, and they hide behind this. But anyway, I was talking about the neocentrists, the IDW crowd, like, and they kind of, like, they have a very weird kind of relationship to the far right, though, because some of them are, I would argue, far right, and then crypto trying to, like, inject these ideas into the discourse through their magazines, through this superficial culture war critique of identitarianism and therefore the left from their point of view. But other of them are interesting. And this doesn't get talked about much, but a lot of people who are in this, like, IDW sphere are actually ex-fascists, ex-alt-right people from, like, 2014 to 16, who moderated, especially after the Fash really got their asses kicked in the post-Battle of Charlottesville street fights, and, like, moderated down to, like, anti-identity politics, like, centrist politics, and not always just because of, like, the threat of Antifa or whatever, but also because of, like,
I think it has very little to do with the threat of Antifa, frankly.
Yeah, right. A lot of it is actually that they legitimately kind of, like, saw the far right, and especially saw the way that the far right was, like, weak, and also the way that the far right was, like, really
In their minds,
ugly.
the far right was really ugly and looked a lot like the left, and
Exactly.
that's the way they would talk about it.
That's how they would talk about it. Yeah, these people. And so they basically are like, yeah, I guess I'm for the free market sort of, but not the way that it was before the crash, and I don't really care about that. I think the culture war is like really awful, and I just want to like tune out and peace out. So a lot of like, so like you sometimes see this in like the post-rationalist sphere. You see this around publications like the Lindy Man's publication and newsletter, like, you know, people who like maybe were once in the far right and then kind of like have moderated towards the center. So it's like this like kind of like pipeline from the far right into the center. So it shows you how like diffuse and complicated these relationships can be, is why I'm kind of bringing this up. And then finally, there's the last two groups. So one of them is the blue checkmark Twitter, which I would call Bidenism.
Which everybody hates.
Which everybody hates. There's actually a good word in Spanish that would describe them. The word in Spanish for these people would be el oficialismo, which there's no good translation for it, but it just kind of means like the media apparatus slash fandom slash
The
like
literal translation would
institution.
be like the officialist. Like,
yeah, the officialist faction, which is kind of just a name for the media apparatus and fandom and propaganda apparatus of the party in power, basically. So like both within the state and then also outside of it. So the oficialismo of the United States kind of involves like the Beltway journalists and legacy media people who have the blue check marks, and the Biden administration like apparatchiks and like, you know, public facing policy academics in like IR and econ and whatever. I think that basically covers it. So I'm just going to move on to the last group, which is, of course, the fascists, the far right. And in the context of 2021, this tends to be the kind of dregs of the alt-right, whose power I really think was broken over the course of the Trump administration, through a combination of like Trump's failure to implement their program and his like, you know, and then his loss of power in 2020. And also I know, Varn, you probably are more skeptical of this, but I actually think that losing those street battles to anti-fascists really broke the backs of the grassroots movement that would have had a chance of growing. Anyway, these people, you all probably know them, so I won't dwell too much on most of them. Richard Spencer, Nick Land, Bronze Age pervert, and their fandoms, right? The remnants of the alt-right, which kind of consisted of a bunch of different little groupuscules like the Manosphere and the white nationalists and the neo-reactionary movement and the human biodiversity people. It's the race and IQ people. And we can get into this later, but part of the reason why those people are harder to find nowadays is because there was actually a huge purge of them. On some of the social media websites, especially Facebook and Twitter, that related to that, you kind of have these like esoteric fascists who are pretty much, and you know, this might kind of fall into more like the ex-fascist sphere in the case of some of them. So I don't want to like necessarily throw aspersions out, but they certainly were involved in the far right, you know, a few years ago, and did a lot of the and engaged and believed in a lot of the sincere ideas, like the inevitability of hierarchy and the inevitability of the superiority of some over others, which gives them the right to rule, that the fascists believed in. And I'm thinking of like you know, unaligned accelerationist Twitter or cave Twitter. People like Justin Murphy, people like Dark Mutualists, these kind of people who like engage in very odd, esoteric, avant-garde discourses are actually
who kind of like will occasionally pretend to be leftist sometimes and then jump away from it. And
yes, exactly. And then like it's kind of like some of them are getting into the cult now, and it's like these very difficult to parse discourses that unless you've been following like very obscure internet discourses for like 10 years,
is a good way to hide fascism for a long time. I mean that
exactly.
Like,
and then. And yeah, that's the long game, really, because if the movement reemerges in like 5-10 years, then those people will be there and they'll have some knowledge that they accrued from the heydays of neo-reaction in the 2010s.
I think what we've seen that is the liquidation of that, and then the QAnon conspiracy culture, which is like harder to purge and more nebulous and not explicitly racialist, even though it rhymes over and over again, has enough non-whites in it that you can't really pin it down as a racialist movement.
Right. And then the most dangerous of the fascists, and this is where I think Varn is going to disagree, but I really think that this is true, is also the most public faction of them, and because they're public, they've kind of like hidden their cards in some respects and keep them close to their chest. But this is a group that I've been keeping an eye on for a while, and I'm very concerned about them. It's the National Conservatives. That's the kind of branding that they've taken ever since they started like having magazines and conferences and kind of backing candidates in Republican primaries. It's essentially the attempt to institutionalize and also like give intellectual theoretical legitimacy to, usually using kind of like former neo-reactionary type ideas smuggled in through the back door, to a kind of like permanent Trumpist faction within national politics. And furthermore, to do so while also figuring out, and this is the really scary thing about them, how to plan the economy. Because all these people have basically become red pilled to the fact that free market capitalism doesn't work, and that the boom years of capitalism, from like the 50s to the 70s, happened as a result of like dirigiste mixed economies with strong social democratic elements. And what these people essentially want to do is figure out how to plan the economy, because a lot of that knowledge has been lost, in order to institute a kind of Herrenvolk social democracy for white people, or for Christian traditionalists, or for a coalition thereof who can support right-wing cultural politics.
There are a lot of move towards integralism as opposed to even implicit white nationalism, because I think that they just understand the realities of the demographic shifts, and even someone like Nick Fuentes has to pay lip service to it. If you listen to his rhetoric, and he's not part of that. I mean, he's much more extreme. But when you think about the national conservatives, they are a branch of what we would have called paleo conservatives 10 years ago. I would say that people are saying Proud Boys. They're actually more than that.
No, they're much
have
more.
A real intellectual like huff. They're people around the Claremont Institute. They're people around
the most important is American Affairs magazine. The second most important is a magazine called Palladium, and the third most important is a magazine that's been around for a while. It's like a Bush era right-wing Christian Catholic magazine called First Things, but it's been revamped under kind of like new editorial kind of like oversight into a national conservative publication.
Yeah, basically the paleo conservative traditionalism didn't have a whole lot of sway under Trumpism, because it was totally discongruous with that. Same with the Claremont Institute, which is kind of the intellectual heft behind these movements, even more than First Things is. This is my spear. I come out of this spear, frankly. Like, these are people that some of the.
Varn, you muted yourself. What? I think you muted yourself by accident. I don't know what's up. What are we doing? Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Varn's having technical issues, so I will ramble. So basically these the thing about these types who are writing for American Affairs Palladium, and now in the new version of it, First Things, is that I think that they are different from how it was under when Varn was kind of in this like paleocon sphere. I think that it's evolved as a result of the kind of grassroots emergence of fascist movement after the 2008 crash. I think that these the NatCons have evolved in a much more dangerous and disturbing direction, because I think that they're very self-consciously like aware in a way that I don't feel like paleocons usually were, about the kind of like, well, from their point of view, I disagree fundamentally with this, but they're the kind of like inherent superiority of some people over others, and the need for like an elite rule, that democracy, if it ever exists, is only ever a veil and a cover for some form of elite rule or another, and and that and that frankly democracy has kind of failed as an experiment, and that therefore the societies that really embrace the future are kind of moving towards a new equilibrium that will kind of take us back to kind of how things were before the French Revolution and the rise of mass democracy movements. And what they're shooting for, these guys in particular, and you can see this in the latest manifestos of Palladium that just came out a few months ago. A lot of them really basically want a system modeled off of China, state capitalist China, where large sectors of the economy are still planned and there's still large scale industrial policy, and it's under autocratic rule and no longer has to deal with the kind of petty constraints of democracy, except that instead of the Chinese Communist Party or the American equivalent thereof ruling, it would be a council of tech billionaires, which is why they try to advertise basically within the tech sphere, and also why they probably have billionaire backing, to judge from the fact that their headline speaker in the National Conservative Conference that American Affairs put together was none other than Peter Thiel, famous crypto-fascist billionaire who famously stated that liberty and democracy are no longer compatible, and therefore we should choose liberty, where liberty means the ability of the rich to do as they please with their money.
One thing I would pause you on is people don't realize that this group, both these groups, Palladium, American Affairs, to even the Claremont Institute, have tried to recruit leftists and former leftists in their ranks, partly because I think they know that the traditional demographic of which they are associated, which Trumpists are associated with, is dying. Literally,
Right.
actually, they're literally dying. They were a minority of boomers who were white, and between secularization and just age, that demographic is going away.
Right.
They know that it's part of their whole pitch, but they also know that as far as who they're reaching out to, because the one thing that we have to talk about is that American Affairs didn't just get Nagel. They also got people who are still considered legitimate on the left because they pay well.
Yes, and nobody knows where the money comes from. This is a big kind of source of the rumor mill in left-wing kind of intelligentsia spaces of writers when they get together to talk about stuff. It's where the hell is American Affairs getting the money to pay people $2,000 for
they'll
for
pay
a
1,000 or 2,000
article.
for they pay 5 times market rate.
Where are they getting?
Article.
So they're not getting this cash from subscriptions, and frankly, there's the American Compass Institute, which is a big think tank that Julius Krein, editor of American Affairs, just started, and nobody knows where they get their money from. And but we have these billionaires showing up at their conferences, so you put 2 and 2 together, and what does it look like, right? The nobody's proven it, but this is. It's a kind of open secret that this is kind of what's happening. And somebody asked, but what are they actually doing? Well, they're doing 2 things. One is that they're trying to figure out the technical knowledge of how to plan the economy, because like I said, that knowledge has been lost. And whoever implements some form of mixed system economy with corporatist elements, whether it's social democratic or fascistic, in the OECD countries, is going to create more economic prosperity than we've seen in the 50 years of neoliberalism, and therefore will have a material basis for a political coalition with which to rule for 50 years at least. So that's the technical knowledge for how to do that is actually a big deal, and it will take a lot to discover, and they're putting resources behind discovering it. The second thing that they're doing is that they're actually backing candidates. The hillbillyology guy is funded by these same people. That's right, and backed by all their magazines and running on their talking points.
Here's what I don't know. All right. And I don't want to sound conspiratorial at all, but there have been times where I've seen leftists take weird stances. Are people who were once respected by leftists, who probably never were. I mean, Glenn Greenwald was never really a leftist. And I was talking about his whole posturing with Substack and the way he used his hate beefs specifically as a driving model. And people don't like when I point it out, but it's fucking true. It's not even really right-wing ideologically driven. It's literally driven as an engagement model that keeps clicks up. I mean, I think that's almost provable. But regardless, you'll start see him saying things. Well, J.D. Vance is an anti-imperialist, even though he's in the military and not. He actually takes some neoconservative stances on things, and that Vance's own positions have actually varied wildly. And you'll see more and more of this in the future. They have not been a powerful organization in the past because, frankly, the neoconservatives have more money. Defense contractors have more to lose. That period is over.
Right. Like they're basically like, there's a power vacuum because the liberal political establishment has been liberal in the sense of centrist, which involves the neoliberals in both the Republican and Democratic Party, which the neocons were basically economically that. That has been totally discredited. So the old establishment is kind of broken. Bidenism is this attempt to patch together some new consensus, but it's unclear whether it will work. And basically, it's still open season for who can figure out what the post neoliberal order is, and the far right and the far left are both going for it. This is why we're in such a precarious situation. And politicians like J.D. Vance don't just appear out of nowhere. J.D. Vance is using talking points that were developed in current affairs in much the same way that AOC
American
is using
affairs.
American affairs, Jesus Christ, not current affairs, not current affairs, not current affairs. Current affairs, libertarian socialist, different thing. Sorry. Thank you. J.D. Vance is using talking points that were basically developed in American affairs in much the same way that AOC is using talking points that were initially developed, I would argue, in left-wing intelligentsia magazines like M+1 and Jacobin before 2011 that very few people read. But they have this kind of like influence that's larger than themselves, because when you create a discourse that allows you to have an analysis of the world that seems like it actually describes things, that's very powerful, and it can spread virally through these social networks and influence people's perceptions. And if those people are positioned within institutions that let them act on those perceptions, then you're in play in these political games. So
sort of.
I'm simplifying a bunch of steps here.
Well, there's also a part of this where there's a material reality that really these kind of network discourses hit hard. You see that in AOC, actually, in her inability to both continue with that discourse as she's currently pivoted it, and also act as a member of the Democratic Party with its seniority system, which she cannot bypass despite her viral popularity. I mean, AOC in a way is actually the left-wing version of a Trump presidency, in that her virality and her constituency are way disconnected. And probably that has meaning, but not the meaning most people think. I know a lot of people around the right wing of the DSA think that means that like they're winning the future, which I think is
ridiculous,
hilariously ridiculous.
It's completely insane. This is for the bonus episode that we're going to record, but suffice it to say that the right wing of DSA right now, a lot of whom are still in the establishment of the org, are completely deluded, and they're going to get steamrolled by the developments that happen in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, you know what I think. My hopeful discourse is I think a lot of this is not even 10 years steamrolled. I think it's going to get steamrolled real quick.
That's true. That's true. Within the next 10 years is kind of maybe it's closer to this side. Yeah, that's right. It's an optimistic pessimism. So overall, why did I go through the factions? It's not just to show off my sociological acumen and my ability to give labels to things. It's to show you that how difficult it is to get any sort of hearing of any scale as cultural producers, an independent person who says, I want to be a writer, unless you appeal to
one of these demographics.
Exactly, to one or several of these groups, which
and
are
they
organized
interplay with each other too. I mean, like, for example, you talk about the stupid poll faction and the quote post left, and like the national conservatives actually do have interplay, even when they don't realize it, even when they don't mean to. Similar to the fact that occasionally left communists and left critics of even official social democracy get interplay with the post leftists in a way that makes, frankly, me feel uncomfortable, because I see my talking points being used for the opposite means of what I use them for.
Yes, no, absolutely, and it's very paralyzing as a writer. I have to say, people who follow my account will know that I have not published. I published like one piece this year, one piece the previous year, and one piece the previous year. I'm very slow. And part of the reason I'm very slow as a writer is because of this horrible feeling of the super ego, not of just one faction, but of multiple factions at my back, thinking about how something that I write will play with these different audiences in a way that could potentially forbid me from writing in the future for the places that I want to write for. And it's very scary because, and you know, I'm just open about admitting it. You know, but all writers right now are scared about this because you have to consciously strategize about how you can like appeal to your home base or appeal to several of them as a kind of diverse portfolio to manage the risk. Because, for example, you might be able to consciously strategize how you might move between them. If you get canceled in one of them, you can do a transition to another one. And then from that perch, you can write about a critique of the other thing, but then you have to accept the dogmas of this little group, you know, that you're moving into. And would that suffocate you in other ways and not let you write the things that you want to write? In other words, we're in this suffocating cultural environment.
Yeah, I literally exist in a media sphere where, not here on Varn blog where I have a small, very dedicated audience, but on other things that I've done, that the pivoting on these levels has led to me like alienating audiences without changing a single fucking position, because of the way different orientation groups have interpreted or misinterpreted what I said. And when the plausible deniability was removed, they became hostile. Whether that, there is one faction you forgot to mention, which is tanky Twitter.
Oh yes, yeah. I kind of rolled them under Rose Twitter, but they are distinct. So yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, yeah, I mean they're kind of the edgelord reaction to Rose Twitter, but yeah. But they're growing and enough that I'm beginning to encounter them IRL and not just on Twitter.
Right. Yeah, everyone says, "Oh, the tankies are only online." It's not true. They're actually spreading a lot of influence in DSA, to the point where basically the de facto DSA position on a number of hot foreign policy issues is the tanky line, and even among people who are not tankies. So that's an unfortunate evolution in my view, because I'm not a Leninist or a vulgar anti-imperialist campist, but like I'm of the vulgar. I'm of what I suppose is the unsophisticated belief that anti-imperialism means opposing all forms of imperialism, including all the inter-imperial rivals who are trying to carve up the planet. But that's a very outdated, 2000s, I guess, idea. So yeah, that's. But I think it's just important for people to internalize the panopticon, right? Like a lot of this comes from the fact that you have all these little groups, but they're not just isolated. They are mutually co-constituting each other through this conflict as engagement dynamic that I was describing, which means that everybody's looking at everybody else at all times in order to see like which box they fall into.
And how they're gonna position, what position they should take on something. That's why they feel like they have to have positions on everything, even things that aren't relevant to their immediate politics, is because it's constitutive design. Matt Christman, I have many criticisms of him, but he's actually right on this. And a lot of this politics is out of spite, but a lot of people think of it as just this broad conservative liberalizing thing, and it's micro identity specific. If we were to talk about this in relation to, say, black leftists or black Twitter, we would see general micro trends between like the Adolf Reedites and the ADOS and the general reparationsist and the Bidenist, etc.
And the Bidenist and so on. And there was a recent flare-up in Black Twitter as well around a Chronicle of Higher Education article by Jason England, I think, that critiqued. It was a self-critique. It was a very well-written article. There was a self-critique of the Black intelligentsia. It was kind of modeled off of Harold Cruz's book, The Problems with the Negro Intellectual, from the 60s, but it kind of doing it for the present moment and criticizing some of the dynamics that we're talking about here, but specifically with regard to Black intellectuals. And that got a very positive reception from some people, but then a very nasty reception, from particularly the Nicole Hannah-Jones fandom, because he kind of critiques her in it. And it's not even that hard a critique. And for the record, I actually like a lot of Nicole Hannah-Jones' work, especially when she was an investigative journalist. And even I think the 1619 Project has a lot of virtues that kind of get lost in the culture war stuff. It has some virtues. Look, popularizing the new history of capitalism, people, is like for the
Yeah,
public
that's actually I would agree with.
is objectively good. Now, the new history of capitalism people have huge limitations, and 1619 Project shares their limitations and in some ways exaggerates them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, and makes them bigger, and also makes bigger claims. I mean,
but at the end of the day, it's a net good for those ideas to be more public. I think that the some of the reaction to it is kind of like the idea that like some of the reaction to it is a legit critique of the new history of capitalism stuff, like, you know, and some of it, like where slavery is a capitalist institution, or even an institution which made capitalism possible in like the North, which is a kind of tenuous claim. The fact that it's capitalist.
I think it's interesting because, I mean, to get back on this a little bit, the slave owners themselves actually did not posit themselves as capitalists. I mean, the word socialism is actually
Genevieve
by a slave owner.
Genevieve talks. Whoa, is that true? It was coined by Pierre Leroux. It was coined by Pierre Leroux in the 1830s. I don't think it was coined by.
Nope.
Says who? Who did that?
Excuse me. Sociology. So, the term sociology was coined by a slave owner who was an anti-capitalist.
Okay, sociology I can believe, but
Pierre Leroux socialism.
Sorry, this is left book pedantry to the max. This is us in the comments thread sniping at each other.
Well, this is actually this may be a contested fact. Actually, it may be convergently developed, because the word socialism was not used in the way it was used. It wasn't used in the left wing at all. It's way it was used by forget the name. I've read this book by this justifier of slavery, was that it was for a functional society. It was a functionalist definition of the social.
Okay.
It was
I could see somebody saying that.
This guy also thought that like slavery was good, anti-capitalism, and blah blah.
Yeah.
Which is also
Carlyle famously made the argument. Thomas Carlyle, the famous reactionary Tory essayist who people like for some reason. I mean, he can be a good prose stylist, but he's not actually that good. He famously did an argument in favor of the Confederacy in the war because the slaves are assets who have to be treated well, whereas wage slaves, like they have in the North, are just they're just to be discarded, and then the unemployed are to be taken on. And so it's actually more violent to be a factory owner who employs wage slaves than it is to be a slave owner who takes care in this like patriarchal way of the slaves. So definitely there's some of that in there. But
I have a claim that sociology was coined by Albaces and later in Comte. I got evidence contradicted that. That's European. That's European. Frankly, most leftists are Eurocentric in a way that they don't actually know that there's developments that contradict the claims of all these things being invented by fucking French people.
No, it's definitely true. Yeah.
But regardless, they can be convergently developed. That the first published use of the term sociology in English let's see what the claims are. Most people attribute it to Sayes in 1780. But the word in English, okay, so this is where the difference in claims come from.
Okay.
Was coined separately by the guy I'm talking about for use of sociology in English.
This is real left book hours right now. This is
well, this will be edited because it's already almost 3 fucking hours long.
While you're looking this up,
somebody actually attributes it to Spencer, but I've seen it also attributed to this this guy. I did a I've seen both that and socialism attributed to this guy. I did a history on over at Swampside Chats in the enemy camp, who talked about it in terms of slavery, and I've seen both claimed. And so we have someone saying it's quoted by Leroux. You know what? pedantry is anti-socialist.
That is true. That is true. The Cyber Dandy has been asking very patiently over and over again, who were the first revolutionary socialists, and that's a very complicated question. It could be the Diggers, it could be the Enragés in the French Revolution.
Who would have called themselves socialist?
It could have been Babeuf in his conspiracy.
Probably Babeuf, and then the Blanquist, but.
The first French revolutionaries, I think, to call themselves socialists were in the 1830s, after the revolution, and it was like the Pierre Leroux magazine crowd, I think.
Yeah, it's Leroux, and then the Social Workhouse, and what's his face,
right.
who Marx deliberately didn't call himself a socialist at first because of the French Association. That's why he picked communists for a while, and then went back and forth. The whole
right. Yeah. There's a great book if you're interested. Who's that? Cyber Dandy. It's a multi-volume work, and all of it is online on archive. A History of Socialist Thought by G.D.H. Cole. It's a kind of like ecumenical, like pan-socialist history of the movement from the 50s by probably one of the great libertarian socialist economists who nobody knows about, G.D.H. Cole, who he wrote a lot about guild socialism in the 20s and economic planning in the 30s and 40s from this very syndicalist, sympathetic perspective, all about worker control and stuff. But he was also a great historian and wrote this multi-volume history that's very well regarded. Probably still one of the best sources on that. So
yeah, the two books on early socialism I tell people to read would be Cole, and then Harry H. Laudler, which is his History of Socialism, is also quite good. Also, sympathetic to Marx, but not a Marxist, more in the social democratic vein. But both good histories. I'd read them both. I'd also read Korsch if you want something more Marxist-y, but not official communist-y. So there you go. But it's I would say probably, as far as in spirit, it's probably the Diggers, the Levelers. There's an argument to be made. The first communists are like a Zoroastrian egalitarian movement in the 2nd century BCE. So go
absolutely
with what you wanted.
Or people who wanted to restore the pre-temple gift economy, and Mesopotamia would do a revolt, right, that's half historicized, or people resisting the encroachment of states, on their territory, but they had basically horizontal and collectivized property, or whatever. There's all sorts of it can vary, but the self-ascribed socialist movement starts in Europe,
1830s France. Then the communist or the communalist 1840s Germany and the German lands, because Germany's not even a country yet. And then you have all the utopian socialists who didn't call themselves socialists, who were popular in the United States, who are also from France and the UK. There's a massive prehistory that we've kind of forgotten.
And it's very important, I think, to understanding some of the stuff that's at stake, because in some ways Marxism kind of obscures some of the questions, I think, that are not just utopian questions, but actually have to do with okay, what do we actually want? But anyway, this is all kind of getting far afield of where we wanted to be. So let's get back to
back, because we're almost 3 hours in.
But this is, I don't know. I think that we're judging from the response that people are doing in the comments.
This is great. Useful. I actually don't mind. I'm not looking forward to editing this down for the audio podcast. In fact, I might not.
Okay. But hold up. So, okay. You've got the panopticon. Everybody's looking at everybody else, just like that stupid prison that Jeremy Bentham designed, where the prisoners can all see each other, through the glass that encages them. And you've got all these, as Orwell put it, the smelly little orthodoxies contending for people's souls, and they're self-organized into these little echo chambers that are perpetuated through the algorithms that send content to consumers' eyeballs as funnels, and that kind of consolidates these echo chambers, which then also mutually co-constitute each other through this kind of adversarial mutual symbiosis that grows them through conflict as engagement. So another factor that kind of gets that we have to add into the mix, and we kind of talked about this when we talked about wokeism, but again, it's true of all of these different factions, is the internal censorship, right? sorry, well, it's the vulnerability to censorship. And like, you basically had like, I would argue that you have like two kinds of censorship. You have internal censorship, which is when you self-censor as a result of trying to like stay within the stay within the limits of some group that you want to be in the auspices of. And then there's like external censorship, which is usually like the state and its apparatus, usually some formal censorship apparatus, like clamping down on you. In the 20th century, we had both of these. We basically had internal censorship that was ubiquitous in the 20th century because of the dominant centralized legacy media being highly consolidated and under this rigid top-down control. So this leads to, I've reiterated this a million times, effectively leading to central control over anything that can get a wide distribution by the gatekeepers, right? So you have to fall within the limits set by the gatekeepers. There was also external censorship, right, that mostly came from the state and thus depended on the state structure. And under liberal democracies, external censorship was relatively lax compared to like dictatorships of one sort or another, and it grew more lax with time. External censorship existed in the United States and other liberal democracies through the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was actually socialists and anarchists like the IWW and their free speech movement, and James Joyce in his and the battle that the Dial had. I believe it was the Dial, legally to publish Ulysses, which was considered scatological and obscene. And then later Allen Ginsberg, trying to publish Howl, got a similar lawsuit. And in both cases, they were themselves socialist left-wingers who were defended by the same left-wing lawyers who defended communists and anarchists and socialists when they got arrested and that kind of thing. So it was actually socialists who participated in who played a key role, I would say, in expanding free speech rights, or more precisely, freedom of the press, right? The diminishing of external state censorship, over time through these like legal cases and social movements and so on. Now, the new media environment, the distributed media environment that we live in, adds another external censor, right? So like probably you all have internalized already how we have like internal censors in each of the little echo chambers. You have to conform to the line that is kind of like in each echo chamber, or if you fail to, you get canceled, and then you have to like transition to one of the echo chambers where you can. We already talked about that. But the external censorship actually exists in this environment, has actually been heightened in this environment in a way that's not often talked about on the left. For complex reasons, but basically it's not just the state. In fact, it's not primarily the state, at least legally. It's the platform and whoever owns the platform, which will tend to be one of the big tech companies. Now, in reality, it's not that the tech companies are more powerful than the state. That's not it, really. It's that the tech companies are the institutional organ through which the censorship happens. And then the state can put pressure on the tech companies and probably also just peacefully collaborate with them behind closed doors in a public-private partnership, let's say, in order to censor what shows up on the social media platform. Because remember, everything is done via the platform. Everybody advertises for their initiatives. Everybody gets the subscribers that they use in their subscription models to fund themselves and be able to continue as a going concern. So if you remove someone completely and utterly from the platform, it's tantamount to being wiped from public existence. That's a bit of an exaggeration, because if you have a lot of independent wealth, you can create your own platform, but that's an option that very few media producers have. And frankly, the ones that have it tend to be on the right and backed by billionaires. For the most part, being wiped off from social media means being unable to fund cultural production of any sort, whether it's art or journalism. And although media in the broad sense has decentralized significantly, and although the internet was originally a highly decentralized infrastructure, I would argue that the incentives that led to the rise of social media, right? The information overload, which led to people wanting these kinds of like more centralized platforms, or at least those centralized platforms being able to make an argument for themselves and then becoming hegemonic, has led to a situation where the platforms are owned by private oligopolies that are as massively centralized as the very 20th century media oligopolies that we have fought so hard to escape.
In fact, they're more centralized, frankly.
Yes.
They're more conglomerate-y. They have more ties to other parts of the infrastructure. They have more control over even access to stuff like personal banking. Like it's worse than those conglomerates, and it happened very fast, like in the term of about 6 years. I mean, Google
Yeah.
maybe in the term of 15, but Facebook's consolidation was like, remember we all thought Facebook was going to die in 2011?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, and instead it expanded worldwide and consolidated until it became 80% of internet traffic. While it's dying now, so many of the platforms that are its competitors are also owned, have been bought out and subsumed into Facebook anyway. So while people are leaving it, it's becoming kind of a static platform. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely. And this is, I think that unfortunately people are hesitant on the left to talk about this story because the popular frontism, which was a necessary, well, Varn's analysis is probably going to differ from mine.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think it was necessary, but go ahead.
Because he doesn't think it was necessary. I think it was necessary. I think that there was a serious threat starting in 2016 and continuing for the next several years afterwards, that we could have ended up with a right-wing dictatorship on the style of Putin in this country.
I think that's something that people tell themselves so they feel good about wasting their time.
No, I disagree. I know
you disagree because you're objectively wrong. But
yeah. All right. Well, you can choose for yourself, listener or viewer or whatever. But in my opinion, my analysis is that it was a real threat. And so I understand why
what agenda could a Trump agenda got without the Democratic Party's imperator? What could it have done?
Well, first of all, it didn't need the Democratic Party's imprimatur. Trump had a majority.
He did not have a majority for his actual agenda, which is why you didn't get most of it done.
Yeah, but the thing is that a lot of that, in my view, came from miscalculations in the Steve Bannon kind of like faction within the administration. It came from a number of things. First of all, Trump himself is not ideological. So he was not. There was a grassroots fascist movement which was riding his candidacy to greater prominence, and he himself was kind of like spitting out some of their talking points because they were working. And so and he had an advisor for a while who was legitimately trying to push that movement, which is Bannon, and then also like Michael Anton and some of the other people who were like involved, who basically came up out of the kind of like the fascist internet sphere. But the problem is that he himself was not ideological, so he was not consciously pushing this project. He was doing whatever those who kissed his ring wanted by giving them like the independent control over the project and then letting them do it. And second of all, like that fascist faction within the administration miscalculated, because they, instead of doing what they probably should have done, which is trying to get the neoconservatives on their side through promises for military expansion under a NatCon kind of like agenda.
That would have also sunk their own agenda. I mean, this is kind of the problem that they have, is it's an incoherent fucking agenda. This is always a problem I have with Popular Front status. Normally, the fascists aren't undone by us; they're undone by themselves.
No, be that as it may, I still think that there was a real threat of it, and I think that this is it's irrelevant, it's immaterial, because the point is that a lot of people thought this way. So to the point that I'm making, all that it takes is that there were a lot of people who were like me, and also a lot of people who were like me in a much less this is a bit self-congratulatory, but in a lot less of a self-aware way. Because one of the things that I knew was going to happen as a result of this, because having studied like the popular frontism of the 30s, is that we all need to stick together, and very casual drop of the fascist faction. Who the fuck was that? I mean, people like Bannon and Anton and other people in the administration who were explicitly connected.
Steve Seller is the only one who actually survived all the purges in the administration.
Right.
Kind of a paleo-conservative faction that was more friendly to them too. They were all purged pretty early on thing is, they were purged pretty early on to make good with the GOP. The GOP coalition would have never accepted what they wanted to do.
And I don't know. I think it depends. I think there's a lot more contingency.
All you fucking leftists have a Bonapartist theory of fucking history. You all do.
Well,
like
no, I think that there's structural factors, but I think that there's agents operating within the structural constraints, and then they can push things one way or the other.
but the
That's not
structural
one.
constraints were totally predictable, is what I'm saying. Like, I was not worried about this the way you were, because the
Well,
problems that you see that collapsed the Trump administration were obvious to me. Like, I was not worried.
all right.
And
Well, you know.
and you guys were off like making liberals stronger and saving the center for the rest of us.
Well, look, the point is that enough people believed this. This is all that I wanted to say. It doesn't matter ontologically, which is true.
Enough people believed in the need for the Popular Front.
Enough people believed in the need for the Popular Front that an ideology of left unity kind of emerged, that it's like, well, you know, we all need to stick together against the fascists and do whatever's necessary in order to stop the fascists. And actually, I would argue that this is part of what led to the tanky revival, because Leninists
agree with that.
Because Leninists were basically like non-existent in the activist left, like, you know, in the post-occupied period.
I would say like two reasons. One is anti-fascism, and the other is to socially signify that you are not a social democrat.
Right. Yeah. That definitely, especially after like 2020, I think that second one became very, very profound for a lot of people. But the more important thing for us is that it also led to the rise of leftists looking the other way at the illiberalism of the centrist neoliberals. Like in other, well, okay, that's too cute a phrase for most people to understand. So let me just put it in a concrete way. Like, the centrists basically, like the anti-fascist factions of the left, you know, in this kind of Popular Front mode, were soft on the neoliberals to the extent that they were engaged in anti-fascist work. And one of the crucial ways in which they were soft on the neoliberals is that when the centrists started pushing the tech companies to censor social media, the leftists not only looked the other way, but when leftists would talk about how this is not a good precedent to set because it could just as easily be used against us, basically, like, you know, the in-group consensus was such that anybody who articulated that was, like, you know, under cancel risk, basically.
Right. And the idea is like, oh, well, it's just a state of exception that we need to have a Smithian logic with this. And
right.
Which I was even at the time. So you don't understand your own power if you think you have any control over that. Like,
right. And this ended up kind of I mean, we're not yet at the stage where it's been absolutized, because Varn and I are having this conversation.
Yes, and obviously we're not being censored yet. But I'm also not monetized on YouTube either. So
yeah, but you never would have been, because you're political. That's or you're openly, actively political, as opposed to like subculturally political. But what I'm about to say is not that we are being censored, like, for the most part. What I am saying is that there are events that have taken place that don't get talked a lot on the left that are laying down, like, the technological, legal, and kind of just practical precedent for a total mass purge of the left from social media, which, given the political economy that we have laid out, you can understand that would be a catastrophe for the ability of leftist media, publications, writers, intellectuals, artists, media people to reproduce themselves.
And I don't want to sound like a proponent of a respectability culture, but the leftist discourse, particularly around like the tanky left and the edgelord left and the post left, etc., is inviting it.
Right. Yes. And this is very important to emphasize. And look, I am not saying, and this is, I think, like, key to some people to hear, that the naive vision of, like, you know, oh, well, you know, like, let the fascists have their marches that they organize across the country because of a principle of free speech that's universal, and if that lets them terrorize, you know, people in that neighborhood, you know, or if that lets them, like, organize larger and larger movements that eventually start, like, you know, doing, like, you know, beer putsch style stuff, that's just totally fine, because it's a necessary sacrifice to civil order. That is not what I'm saying. I think that on the whole, you know, the wave of street fights after the Battle of Charlottesville had a mostly salutary effect on you know, the balance of forces, you know, in the chaotic post 2016 political environment, because I, for one, would not have wanted to see a 1930s style march down Madison Avenue, of torch lit Nazis like that. I would not have wanted to see that, and I'm glad that it was kind of squished before it got to that point. The problem is that by letting the tech companies censor the fascists, as has been done, there was a great Twitter purge of the far right in 2018 that basically led to a whole bunch of the accounts that I referred to under the alt-right, right? Like the Recent IQ people, the Manosphere people, the neo-reactionaries, and this and that. A lot of those accounts were just canceled, wiped out. Facebook did a similar thing.
And their ability to fund was wiped out too, so they couldn't go on underground platform. I mean, it was pretty thorough.
And then when they created their own platform, because they do have some big money backing and were able to do that, that platform was squeezed from kind of like secondary sources like the ISPs and all these other different things.
The same ways that we closing out porn off of, I mean, this is what I was actually the story of that, closing out porn off of OnlyFans. It's the same methodology that they use to get a lot of the tertiary sub and independent platforms closed down and made a mockery of.
Right.
The problem, I mean, you're getting to the problem, and we might disagree on whether the Popular Front was necessary. It was definitely believed in. And taking a stance against it, which I did, was counselable. I did not take a stance against Charlottesville because that was ridiculous, but like taking a stance against turning to people who we thought we were going to defeat to save us in this scenario when they also have more power, when we really had an advantage over them in 2015, 2016, where we do not anymore. Like the strategic loss to the left now is a farce version of the strategic loss to the left under FDR. And I mean that. And I also think the loss to the left of the FDR was world historically bad for not just the Marxist Leninist communists, but for all the left, because it enabled the ability for them to be purged from most of the apparatus of the Democratic Party, which they then consolidated themselves in to be shut out of most officialdom and to get, completely we forget they were chased out of not just the media sphere, but also
the arts,
academia, the
everything.
arts. Like,
the McCarthyist purge was total, and for the time, it was as close as you could get to total without dictatorial method, without explicitly dictatorial methods.
And the infrastructure for it, and the way they were able to do it, was actually the abandoning of a lot of left's own infrastructure to consolidate after 1936 with the Democratic Party after the end of the third period, which was weird because it was actually good for the European left, but it was really bad for the American left because it led to like anti-racists having to be in coalition with segregationists. And we aren't at that extreme today, but we're not far from it.
Well, not to deploy your own rhetoric against you, but have to. The necessity of that is arguably questionable.
Well, it was. I actually don't think it was necessary because frankly, I think what should have happened was the reason why third periodism was what it was, let's be honest, was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Because the communists, because they thought
the Hitler-Stalin Pact like completely broke the will of the street movement. That was a disaster propagandistically.
And then undoing that in the United States for a Popular Front where there was no where also the inability to handle World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution had led to the liquidation of our own Labor Party, or what would have been our own Labor Party and our Socialist Party. Had led to us having nowhere to go but back into the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party was clearly a party of the bourgeois, even if it was probably actually on whole less reactionary than the Democrats until the end of FDR's second term.
That's a whole complicated thing, the switcheroo that happened, because the Republicans were arguably the left-wing party of the two capitalist parties, like through at least the 70s and 90s, and then by the 20s and 30s it's getting very, very complicated because you have the business Republicans as against the progressive Republicans, and then some of the progressive Republicans shaded into socialism, and it was very anyway.
Yeah.
To get away
a
from
complicated history, but the point is now we're in a similar scenario where we don't have any way to fight the purges from social media. We could have had public appeal against part of it, but we've sacrificed that on the grounds because our public appeal would basically be special pleading.
Well, yeah. So here's my take, because Aaron M, and I'm not sure if that's my friend Aaron M. I don't want to say your last name, but if you are,
probably it's not someone I know. I know most of these people.
If you are, hi, good to see you. Ask two questions that I really quite like, and I want to address them head on because I think that they get to the meat of what I'm trying to say, and will also let me talk about some sources that I'm interested in. His first question is, well, it's not a question, it's a statement. I think the fascists being censored is like a let them fight scenario, where I think that's a reference to the Godzilla movie where the guy just sees Godzilla fighting Mothra or whatever, and it's like, let them fight. Okay, that's nice in theory. In practice, it's suicidal, because the problem is that the people who are in charge of the censorship are not just looking at the fascists. This is not speculative. I'm not saying we might get censored in small ways for now, but because, like Varn and I are still having this conversation, the magazines and the podcasts are still monetizing, etc.
But they did put socialists on their terrorist watch list recently as a possible target for terrorist watch and domestic terrorism.
That was one thing. But I'm talking about concrete things on social media. This already happened. For example, in 2020. And this is very little reported on, but there's a good Intercept article about it. Facebook, which is probably the most censorious of the social media at this point, did a pretty big, it was like a medium-sized ban of anarchist and Antifa groups in 2020. The Intercept reported on it. It was not very, it was all very hush-hush, and not many people reported on it. This was at the height of the Floyd uprising, when, remember, there was this discourse among the counterinsurgency people of like, this is all outside anarchists who are coming into town to spark up this trouble, and the Floyd uprising doesn't have any organic support, which is of course total bullshit. But that was the discourse that was used to put state pressure on Facebook, and also probably Facebook autonomously felt this way as well, to ban a shit ton of anti-fascist and anarchist pages. And one of the kind of like ironic things about this is that anti-fascists are oftentimes the ones who either look the other way or even actively advocate for the purging of fascists from social media, which goes to show you that what goes around does come around. And so that's one example. And it was limited, but it is a direct precedent. And I know people who personally were affected by this, and operations that were personally affected by this. And then
like this, like the SWP UK, even though they kind of suck, got shadow banned or actually outright banned from Facebook for a while. Like there's all kinds of groups that were removed. Some of which were not small things. I mean, it was kind of interesting. The SWP UK has been declining in numbers and it's basically dissolved. But I mean, like, it was weird to watch.
And I would just add one more, which is the most disturbing. There's an anti-fascist academic who writes a blog called Three-Way Fight. It's just threewayfight.blogspot.com. And he actually reported on this. It's a very good source for a lot of Antifa type stuff. And by the way, unlike Varn, I'm not knocking Antifa work. I think a lot of that work has actually been very important in terms of stymieing the grassroots fascist movement. And this is the kind of blog that does that kind of stuff. But this was actually about, so the whole premise of Three-Way Fight is that it's an anti-fascist blog that is also anti-neoliberal and wants to emphasize the way that like you can't just do like a vulgar popular frontism. It's a three-way fight between the center.
Alex Ross Reed way you out of a problem.
Right. It's like the center, the left, and the fascists having a three-way fight for the future after the collapse of the neoliberal settlement. So with that as the premise of the blog, he writes about this very disturbing. This is from May of 2021, and I'll link it in the chat. This organization, kind of like one of these like shadowy public-private partnership type think tank things, called the Network Contagion Research Institute. And it's basically an anti-hate think tank whose premise is that socialists, especially like anti-fascist anarchist socialists, but like all socialists generally, the extreme left, are just as dangerous a threat to democracy, whatever that means, probably whatever the Bidenists want it to mean, as the far right, right? Like, and that these ideologies, these toxic extremist ideologies, spread through networks that can be analyzed through network analysis of social media, right? Sounds familiar, right? This back end that shows the map of the whole thing that they have access to and we do not, right? So what you should do is this think tank seems to be kind of like, beginning to do the research about how, in the same way that the far right has been basically censored after they've been mapped as a network and then kind of like surgically cut out of the discourse with maybe some rump remaining that is like, capable of, serving as a, what might you call it? Like the moderated version of something like what those ideas once were. In the same way, it seems that this think tank, which probably has ties to funders in the government who have some kind of connection to large scale, government planning, maybe even military intelligence services, and that's speculation, I should say. But the fact that this think tank exists and that has government funding is not speculation. And basically, they're investigating how to do the same thing to the left. Literally, that's literally their remit. That's literally what they're saying in their thing. Now, I think that there's a lot of interest. I've talked to a lot of people, in this kind of like Beltway policy circles, who low key kind of have this idea of like, well, the Biden is going to do what the left wanted him to do, but not as the left. And then afterwards, there's no need for a left. And if this extremist stuff continues, they should probably, not be allowed to continue. And it's this very casual kind of like, anti-democratic, anti-freedom of the press kind of sentiment that would be, if it is administered, if there is a giant purge of the left so that like, all these like social media accounts are wiped out in a purge, that would be the end of a lot of these revenue streams for these firms. And they have us all mapped out. They know who we are and who we're talking to each other and like, and what the magazines are. This is all public information. And they also have the big data analysis that lets them map the entire network. Not just conceptually, like Varn and I have been doing through our informal schemes of the factions. They actually will have the network graphs, right, that actually draw the actual connections, and they'll know exactly where to thinly slice and what keywords to censor. And obviously it's not a perfect process, but you don't need perfect. You need good enough to get us back to a consensus like the 90s, where speaking openly as a socialist can potentially get you fired from your job. And that this is, unfortunately, it is precisely the left-wing norms that were adopted in the effort to prevent a dictatorship and preserve civil society that it's okay to fire people for their jobs, for their state political beliefs, that they're fascists, that are quite likely to be used against us in a future purge, perhaps even relatively near future, because the Bidenists seem to be seriously considering it, against us, to basically break the backs of a lot of the institutional kind of foundations of the new resurgent left-wing movements, which, we've been talking about like media organizations, but the political organizations through which the actual organizing takes place for things like tenants unions and syndicalist militancy and the Bookchinian neighborhood councils and mutual aid and direct actions against like fascists or police or cop watches or any of the, and of course funding social democratic candidates and that kind of thing. All that happens through organizations that have very similar funding models, pretty much identical funding models to the left-wing media sphere that we've been talking about. So it really would be a devastating event. And you could extend it further. What if they blocked Marxist.org, the Anarchist Library, and LibCom? All those texts that all these people have read that convinced them of these different things. What if that just went offline? Or even just like, it was difficult to access without a VPN, right? Even that barrier would be enough to basically, I would say, cut by like 75% the number of people, at least, if not like 90%, the people who interact with it, right? The Great Firewall of China shows that it can be done. Actually, Chinese big data analysis and censorship and social media and stuff in general shows that these things can be done.
Yeah, and the Marxist-Leninist fans would be happy about that anyway.
Right.
I mean, to be blunt, you don't fight a war through propaganda. You fight a war by fighting a war, and this is a war that you cannot win through standard insurrectionary means. And so I say that by also saying the whole "let's go cosplay revolution" is foreclosed to you. Let's be realistic. So your options really are now to deal with the fact that you have been conned by part of the faction, if you think it was a legitimate reason or not. The fact is, this was predictably the result of what was going to happen. The dependence on these media sources as they were consolidating, the fact that culturally people have underestimated their social power and their political power, which aren't the same thing, and overestimated their social power and their political power, which also aren't the same thing, at the same time. Like the underestimation of what they could have done and the overestimation of what control they had in the general discourse, how they really affected these companies. Capitalists becoming woke isn't out of the kindness of their fucking hearts. Like them discovering that values are good for business is not out of the kindness of their hearts. It's out of a shift in demographics and a consolidation of power.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
and guys, peeps, whoever you are out there, I want you to understand that, like, John Michael and I disagree on a lot. You know, I am probably more of a militant left communist in a lot of ways, and he's probably more of a libertarian socialist, and he believes in things like the Popular Front. And I would rather let the world burn. But historically,
Well, you say that until you're a communist in Germany, like after 1933.
oh well. Here's the thing: like the Popular Front, weirdly, was not a left unifying front. Like
Well,
this is
that is true. That well, it depends on the country, I would say.
right. It
Well,
really does. Yeah, but in the United States, it was done at the cost of the left. In Germany, it was too late. In France, it probably was a left liberal joint project in a real sense. Like it really does go down to the country that you're looking at. But in some ways, you know, I mean, I really wish the Austro-Marxists have won because the need for a Popular Front wouldn't have been necessary.
yeah, the that would have been a nice, humane, possible world, wouldn't have?
Yeah. Conversely, with us, we should have taken a clearer stance towards the center after Occupy. And by a clearer stance, I don't necessarily mean a totally anti-everything they were saying stance. I don't mean constituizing ourselves as the anti-center, because that got us into trouble in the first place. And I say this as a person who that happened to. Like, I thought I was coming out of a right-wing milieu, coming into a far left one, and then I looked around and some of my comrades had become fascist. And I'm not even exaggerating. I don't throw that word around as much as other people. I mean, they literally became fascist.
Right.
And so I had to rethink this was before Trump. I had to rethink my entire strategy for what I was doing to not merely signal counter-constitutive to the center, right? That was vital. But I also wasn't about to start giving them fucking talking points and like accepting their narrativizing of things. I thought the alt-right was a threat on the margin to marginalized people. I did not think they were a political threat. So I thought that what Antifa was doing was worth it on the margin because marginalized people exist on the margin. But I did not think that supporting a Popular Front with liberals would have made much sense, except in the case of Charlottesville, in which case I kind of agree with you. And that was kind of a specific instance because the president stuttered. in a way that presidents in the past had not done. Even ones that, if you look at their policies, were actually objectively more right wing, they would have never given that kind of rhetorical cover to that. You know, even if they were actually, in fact, probably more real right supremacists. And I mean this in kind of,
Right, and that's because there were these links between the grassroots fascist movement and Trump that were like, you know, that were complex. You know, it wasn't he was their guy. They thought he was their guy, and then it turns out, and then it turns out that wasn't quite true. But it was true in moments or in fractions, is the way that I would put it, because it kind of had to do with whoever was ascendant in his inner palace court at any given moment. But what I would say is that my take is different, but arrives at a similar place. Like, when the popular frontism stuff started happening, I knew what the risk was. I basically predicted this aspect of it. Like, oh shit, the Antifa
you and I
stuff
kind
is
of
gonna
agreed on this, even though we didn't agree on the strategy.
Right. It's like the Antifa stuff is gonna lead to, you know, like possible censoriousness being justified, and also the legitimation of Leninist groups that have no business being legitimated. But I was like, that's a risk that's worth accepting, because I think that there's a legitimate threat of dictatorship. However, the problem is that it was still a risk. And now the dictatorship stuff hasn't cashed out, but this other risk is still there, and if anything, is growing. And there's multiple ways that you can get a dictatorship. You can get a right-wing dictatorship, or you can get the junta to restore, you know, democratic order, you know, that exists in all but name. The party of order under Bidenism. And who knows? We don't know where this stuff is going, because things are only going to get worse due to the ecological crisis. Like, you know, the Bidenists themselves are trying to kind of piece together the 90s consensus out of new economic ideas, but it's quite likely that they will fail for a number of factors.
I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned. The Bidenists are at war over their response to Afghanistan, because no one wants to admit that the inevitable was the inevitable.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
And they seem to be willing to throw Biden under the bus to do it, which surprised me. Like, yeah, I'd expect that from British hacks, but watching the Democratic Party do it's been something else.
It's a complete, and it's so funny because Biden is such an ineffectual Brezhnev-like figure. I call him the American Brezhnev often, and I think it's not a bad comparison. Not to give myself credit,
Brezhnev needs better. I mean, Biden needs some better eyebrow game, but yes.
Yeah, that's true. But he's got a similar sleepy thing going on, I would say.
And the similar signifying of the possible end.
Right, exactly. No, seriously though. I do think though that, like, you know, so if we arrive at this scene, I do want to, you know, think about this in the media sense again, because, like, if this really is the risk, the counter risk to the risk of, like, fascist dictatorship, then the only solution by which minimal decency, like, forget, like, you know, socialist utopia or whatever, like, just minimal decency, right? Like a public sphere where developing ideas is still possible, and we might be able to inch the world you know, towards socialism at the very least, right? Like, you know, even that bare minimum decency could only be preserved if there were a principled left-wing, not even just left-wing, radical socialist argument for freedom of the press and against the centralization of control over these platforms, which, as we've analyzed over the course of this whole thing, are basically like the central kind of fulcrum institution that allows the distributed media environment to exist, like financially and you know, and economically. Like, centralized control over those platforms and the use of those platforms for censorship literally eradicates freedom of the press, the very freedom of the press which we depend upon in order to create a radical countercultural public sphere through which alone we can spread these ideas and deepen democracy and extend it into the economy. Like, that would be the argument to make, and it's an argument not dissimilar to the kind of arguments that you would hear from someone like, you know, rest in peace, Aaron Swartz, you know, back in the day, like 10 years ago, There was a left that was for. I mean, usually this happened in like the anti-copyright, kind of sphere, that was pushing for, the communism of ideas and Creative Commons and like and control, democratic control over the internet and anti-surveillance state, right? Like after the Snowden affair, the dismantling of the surveillance state that was revealed and the extent of it, through NSA's PRISM program and things like that. Barrett Brown is another example of this kind of like, and Chelsea Manning. Those were all arguments that were very common 10 years ago, whose logical extension into the present political conjuncture would be something like this principled argument for freedom of the press that I'm talking about from a socialist point of view. But the problem is that it's not an argument that's possible to make in the left under the current kind of consensus that exists within the echo chambers of that govern left wing.
Let's be honest, though. I mean, the other elephant in the room now is these echo chambers are proof that we are becoming faster irrelevant, and that I used to say we were circling the drain, but I don't think we're circling the drain anymore. I think we've already washed out the trash island. Like I think this is a battle that has largely already been lost, and to conceive how to fight it takes a completely different conception of what we need to be doing.
Right, because I mean, like part of what it is also is building up an independent infrastructure. But then,
right. I mean, this is why I support stuff like mutual aid, not because I give a shit about mutual aid. Let's be honest, because charity affects it. Yeah, it's building up self-capacity.
It's building up self-capacity that can create dual power. I mean, I don't think mutual aid in itself does that, but I think that mutual aid can create institutions that can help you do that.
Well, I mean, let's talk about like why the Panthers gave us this, like the breakfast program for. That wasn't because the Panthers wanted to give us a state-funded. It was so that the Panthers would not have that community power anymore. And by funding it that way, it actually undercut it. And yes, people benefited from that. And they truly did, but it undercut the program. And so when liberals celebrate it as a gift from the Panthers, they're also lying to you about what it was intended to do.
Right.
So
yeah.
It's
the and the thing is that like if you have an environment that lacks these kinds of this kind of pressure, because like I'm already seeing in some of these comments a lot of arguments that are like the kind of go-to arguments. They initially sprouted.
I'm ignoring because I find them all dumb.
They initially sprouted from like identitarianism, right? But they're kind of like now even beyond identitarianism, just the left-wing common sense. Well, there's never been free speech, and there's never been, power has always shaped what it's possible to say in society. That might even be true, but it doesn't matter because there's still better and worse, more open and more closed, and also exit options, right? Or the lack thereof. Like, it's not a matter of like reaching the absolute free speech environment where everybody is able to have the best ideas rise to the top in the marketplace of ideas. It's about creating an open enough space that some of the time new ideas that can solve problems can emerge and spread through at least certain networks and exercise their influence. If that didn't happen, all of you would not be socialists. I mean, to be blunt, because it was the relatively open free speech environment of the early internet that allowed Marxist.org to exist and upload all those texts that you spend all your time reading, and then allow you to convert to whatever like flavor of Marxism, standard factory issue you are, right? Like it's the relative openness that was made possible, by these funding structures for these new kinds of media going concerns of the 2000s and the 2010s that created the distributed media environment that allowed the new left-wing intelligentsia to flourish, where before there was a barren wasteland of centralized top-down command and controlled mass media with barely any room for anything counter to that to exist on a national scale.
It's actually a real thing in the United States too, actually.
Right, exactly. So this, like, you might not like the fact that free speech principles actually help us, but they do. Like, and it doesn't have to be like this kind of like naive idea that like, there's never any conflict and it's all the grand debating society in the sky, to understand that a more open media environment, and specifically the materialist preconditions for relative freedom of the press. See, free speech is this kind of like abstract philosophical discourse that I think has its virtues, but ultimately misses the point. The key thing is like the material infrastructure through which cultural production takes place being open enough to allow for dissent. Freedom of the press is kind of my way of thinking about it, but it's the material underpinnings of freedom of the press, which is the economic infrastructure through which cultural production takes place being open enough to admit of these kind of like radical possibilities. And if it's not, then it's game over for us, because as people who believe in democracy, the only way that we can spread.
No, we don't all believe in democracy. Let's be fair, but yes,
it's true. Well, at the very least, an egalitarian and bottom-up way of running society,
right?
Yeah. The which I would call democracy, but
well, most of us do at least believe in that. Mostly, most of the time.
Most of the time, right? So the like if you believe in that, if you don't have that kind of open media environment, it's game over, because you don't have many tools like by which to stay true to your politics and be able to grow a mass movement.
I also find it interesting that people think you can't defeat fascists in the realm of ideas, because you
I find that ridiculous.
You also effectively did. Like,
right.
That is why the Antifa movement is what happened. The reason why it happened was because you defeated fascists in the realm of ideas with a bunch of namby-pamby fucking liberals. Like, otherwise they would have sided with the fascist, which is what half the left says they always do anyway, even though that's not historically true, because the left is lazy and likes slogans more than actually looking at things. But I mean, because that's not because they're the left, but because
it also depends on the country.
Yeah.
not to be
that's true. That's fair.
Not to fall back on the kind of like, well, it depends, but like
it really it does.
But most of the time. But most of the time, yeah, liberals were part of the Popular Front. Like that's just true, and like it's true in the U.S., it's true in the UK, it's true in the UK. It's a little fraught because some parts of the Tories were had their appendages in the brown.
I mean, it's not true. The place is not true is Italy, but Italy is also where there was the most leftists who became fascist, and literally the idea came from leftists, unfortunately.
Also, I think the influence of Pareto had a big effect on liberals, because Pareto was the great economist who was a liberal who had developed a very hierarchical form of liberalism that basically like paved the way for fascism at the very least. And if not, he actually converted fascism, is what I think.
Things really depend on the time how the liberals went. I mean, I will say, unfortunately, after the Marxists were purged and the communists did the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the best opposition to Hitler was actually the revolutionary conservatives, which is, something else.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a very complex history too that people don't know anything about. That's like the oh God, the writer Ernst Junger was in that crew.
Yeah, well, Junger kind of like hated Hitler, but like backed off and took some desk job in Africa to like get out of the situation. But there were other people. I mean, the guy who tried to assassinate Hitler was a revolutionary conservative.
Yeah, von Stauffenberg.
Right,
Stauffenberg.
But it wasn't because like they were necessarily the natural demographic. Is that most of the Marxists were dead, and I mean literally, and then the Communist Party, and despite being purged, had also taken a stance of neutrality under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So like, what are you going to do? There was nobody to oppose, and to really oppose from the left flank in Germany. So like, it gets really muddled. The point is, you're right that you can't use like a simple historical analogy for this, but what we have to look out here is in our history in the United States in specific, that the Popular Front has kind of worked out the least well without a lot of bodies being attached to it. Like, we have been able to be suppressed and sidelined without a whole lot of killing. And that, I don't want to romanticize killing. It's just why we don't think about it as being sidelined in the same way, except when it comes to the McCarthyism. But it really kind of begins at the end of the war. And it also happened at the beginning of the New Deal. So, like, it's something that we have to look at. And there is a truth in that the technologies that we are afraid of right-wing dictators employing against us can be used by the centrist party of order, particularly as they're falling apart. Because let's be honest, like, do you guys think you're going to get much out of this Biden administration?
Right.
Do you really?
Exactly. Especially like when what we need is like rapid decarbonization within the next 10 years, like, and industrial policy in order to pull it through. And
industrial policy.
You're struggling to even be able to like have like some government hires in the infrastructure project, you know, like much less like, you know, a 5-year plan. Like it's not, we're not going to get what we need. So,
and also to do that rapid deindustrialization in a way that doesn't cost massive lives, you need the cooperation of China.
Yeah, exactly. Or famine, right? Like, you know, you don't like rapid decarbonization that doesn't go down in the history books as rhyming with rapid collectivization, right? Like but and the Bidenists aren't even thinking seriously about this. They think that cash transfers and some like 20-year overdue bridge and road fixing is going to be what transforms the economy. And then like, you know, having like,
well, that's why MMT is the most popular form of leftist bullshit right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, kind of. And I still think that their description of the system and how it works, the payment system, is basically correct, at least in terms of a description of a domestic payment system. But their politics. But their politics is very clearly now, I think, like, you know, becoming apparatchiks to the Bidenists in the hopes of getting like some crumbs thrown at them. And their whole central policy plank is the job guarantee, and that is nowhere to be found in any of the stuff. And that's a great
all the stuff that they're actually getting, not what their central policy plank is, but is actually good for rentiers. Like, that's what I've been trying to even get them to just acknowledge, like, admit that the only part, like, you have a potentially radical revolutionary program for real. But the only part that you're getting
is the stuff that's good for the rentiers. So what? Put 2 and 2 together, right? Yeah, no, that's a whole thing. That's more bonus episode stuff, I think. But I think that the key thing,
which we will do on another day, because I'm not gonna know for another 3 fucking hours.
I know. Sorry, but can I get something in though?
No, of course.
I really think that it's important to just kind of like put a bow on it. So we've done all this analysis, but this kind of like allows us to finally attack the thing that we talked about and put aside at the beginning, which is the parasocial aspect of so much social media stuff, right? Like I think that you can only understand. It's become a kind of common phrase, right, on online to complain about the commonality and the perceived or perhaps real necessity of developing parasocial relationships. And this is a very cool word that I don't even know where it emerged from, but it's just become this like currency online, and I love it. It's great. It's perfect because it's this horrible
from studies about television in the 1950s, actually.
No kidding. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, that's wherever it came from, I'm so grateful for it because it perfectly describes something that every writer has to deal with, and it's really quite awful, which is if you're a public figure who uses social media in the ways that we've described in order to secure the views that secure them, you know, some percentage of the views or subscribers who allow them to continue as a going concern. One of the things that has happened as a result of the kind of like face-to-face, well, not face-to-face, but like, you know, very like, you know, they can just message you straight up or reply to you directly in your work and stuff, like kind of nature, the direct nature of the interactions that happen on social media, is that people start treating you as if you're their friend. And this is a very, very dangerous game. Like this is so this gets us into what I think is the most important part of my analysis, which is the political economy of fandom. Like the people talk a lot about fandom and how this is a fandom and that's a fandom, usually as an insult. But I actually think that it's very important to understand, in light of the political economy that we've analyzed, what a fandom means in the age of distributed mass media. So fandoms have existed since the 20th century, the age of centralized mass media, right? But their effect on like revenue, I would argue, was kind of like indirect and also controllable by these like big central firms, because basically, like it was like they had these target demographics that they would intentionally try to, appeal to, and they had like the advertising mechanisms to make that happen. And then like they captured some percentage of that target demographic market share, and then they were able to get the eyeballs that to the advertisers who paid them their bills, right? And so the fandom was not central, like the fandom as a cultural thing, the Star Trek fandom and their endless obsession with like with whether something was canon or not, or the Zelda fandom and their conflicting timelines and all this stuff, was not like a central part of the revenue model in the way that it is in the age of distributed media. Because I would argue that with changes to technology and revenue models in the age that we're talking about, the current age, the combination of all the factors that we've talked about, the result has been that most of the culture producers who are paid are now dependent on the subscriptions of their fandom in order to pay the rent. And this forces new constraints on their media production. It creates a new incentive structure that accounts for many of the dynamics that we associate with fandoms. For example, cancel risk. If you're canceled within the larger sociological faction, right, the factions that we talked about, that a large chunk of your fans are a part of, they might mass unsubscribe, which potentially leaves you unable to continue production, which is why you develop strategies for how you'll do a switch to the opposite faction and so on. Another problem is pigeonholing. You become famous as the person who does anti-woke critiques. Well, now you have a fandom that is accrued to you because you do anti-woke critiques. Your fandom expects one thing from you. And only when you do that one thing does it drive their engagement and their views and therefore their subscriptions. Now, they're going to keep their subscriptions even when you do other things. So you can, in theory, use the articles that are kind of the red meat for your fans to subsidize I shouldn't say articles because that's writers. The products that are like the red meat for your fans, you can use them to subsidize products that were actually what you wanted to do all along. But products take time and energy to make, and also any digression from the one big thing, unless it turns into like another thing that's just as big, runs the risk of alienating the fans so that they eventually kind of like unsubscribe, especially if you do it like continually and they're no longer getting the red meat that they wanted. So things you do which aren't what you originally grabbed their attention are at the very least not rewarded, and potentially they're even actually punished. It might turn out that this thing that you thought was totally innocuous, that's actually about avant-garde art in the 1920s, pisses somebody off, and they are able to do a cancellation attempt on you within your social group that becomes successful, and now suddenly you're not just like not being rewarded, you're actively being punished and kicked out of the anti-woke sphere, for whatever reason.
Oh yeah, I was mentioning that 2 hours ago that kind of happened to me.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I didn't even know it was in the anti-woke sphere, and then I discovered I was out of it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, which is often how it happens too, because this is like one of the things that happens is that you don't even realize the sociological affiliation of most of your fans until they mass unsubscribe to you or something. So obviously, to mitigate this, most creators nowadays just do the one trick pony act, and that's all that they do, and it constrains and constipates art to just as much of an extent as the censorship of the gatekeepers once did. It has degraded and debased artistic production and even political and philosophical production to an enormous extent. And those who go against this tendency oftentimes are, basically punished for it, or at the very least they remain in obscurity with much less revenue than people who lean into it because of the chain that I'm talking about, from engagement, eyeballs, to subscriptions, to the amount of money that you have to pay rent and expand your production or continue it. And then, of course, the last part is the parasocial relationships, right? It's so common it's become a slang term. People thinking that because they consume your indie content on the reg and get a sense of your personality and real nature, or at least so they think from your art or journalism, they think that they're your buddies now. And this brings it with it a number of risks, right? You know, like people can be overly familiar and forward and actually be quite offensive to you. Women and other sexually vulnerable people, queer people, trans people can be like sexually harassed. Stalkers can emerge who are obsessed with you, either because they're like in love with you or because they actually despise you and want to destroy you and create like dossiers, you know, with all your public statements and maybe even like your private chats that they can get their hands on, you know, and in order to eventually do a cancellation attempt. And even when they love you in these parasocial relationships, the thing is that love is a very complex emotion, right? Because there's a great saying that I learned from the great scientist. He's an ecologist and behavioral scientist called Robert Sapolsky, biologist, I should say. He has this saying: love isn't the opposite of hate, or hate isn't the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. Like, and I think that that's a really important statement, because love quickly turns into hate when you do something to the person who loves you that they feel betrays them personally. And some of the most dedicated cancel mobs to public figures on the internet are actually former fans who had a parasocial relationship with the person and felt personally betrayed. They may not have had any actual relationship with the person, even in like friendly DM chats or something like that, but they felt like they had this personal relationship, and then the person did something that was against that relationship in the minds of the fan, and they became the obsessive ringleaders of cancel mobs, endlessly digging up info, obsessively trying to end you because of this betrayal. This is a very tenuous relationship, and it's a difficult problem because the very marketing strategy that you're using in order to get these fans, that some small percentage of which become subscribers that allow you to continue doing your art, entails developing these relationships. It entails being, you know, somebody who is like, you know, who, because remember, we're on the left, right? So being a socialist means being egalitarian. It means like, you know, having this kind of like, you know, person to person relationship with the common ordinary person, the working class person, you know, having not an elitist attitude that you're like better than everybody else, and have this like Olympian distance, but rather this kind of like, you know, engaged attitude, both in the sense of being politically engagé, but then also in terms of like being able to be approachable and being able to be like, this is all part of like what markets you as a left-wing public intellectual or artist or whatever, that makes people feel that your project deserves money because it's something that needs the money of of ordinary people in order to continue existing against the elitist, capitalist, statist establishment. You know, that otherwise would be hegemonic. So you have to constantly maintain that faith, and that oftentimes does involve these parasocial relationships. Finally, there's the risk of what I would call decoupling. And this is a risk especially for left political media projects. It's actually a friend of mine invented this term, and I quite like it a lot. So I'm taking it from him. Shout out to Quinn if you're out there. But it's the panoptic nature of social media, right? Where everybody's looking at everybody else and trying to position themselves in this kind of like social game, and you depend on this environment in order to gain your subscriptions. And you have this constant need to be monitoring and jockeying for position in this ecosystem of other media orgs. All of that means that it's very possible for you, the producer, the artist who's trying to do some kind of cultural knowledge production, to become totally divorced. And this is specifically for like media people, left-wing media people, totally divorced from movements on the ground in the real world, and instead become stuck in this self-referential loop of intramedia drama that never touches upon the things that are actually happening. And if this sounds like the Society of the Spectacle that was critiqued in the 20th century with the centralized mass media, it is kind of similar to it. It is similar to hyperreality that we discussed in the last episode, but the difference is that rather than being the product of this kind of like centralized top-down command and control that creates a monoculture, that is the self-referential monoculture, where all the TV shows that are produced by the same people and regulated by the same gatekeepers are all referencing each other to create this more or less coherent alternative reality. Now it's like distributed. There's like these like little like mental universes of what the world is like that are produced totally from these kinds of like spats between the different like mutually co-constituting echo chambers, and people think that that stuff is the actual stuff that is going on in the world. They think that the culture war is the actual war for politics, and not just the culture war in general, but the culture war as it's discussed in the magazines and the publications and the podcasts and the YouTube channels that are engaged in this like online discourse. And it never breaks out of that. Like you can take this position or that position. It might be better, it might be worse from the point of view of whoever's judging, but it never escapes that bubble. It never actually looks at the real world where actual things are happening, discovers new information and brings it back to where all the journalists and intellectuals and artists are talking. It never actually like surprises you. You ever notice not feeling surprised online, never feeling like something is like, oh wow, I never would have expected that from the people who you follow regularly? That's a sign that you're in one of these echo chambers. And that's a sign that you're stuck not only in that echo chamber, but in the kind of like loop that's created between that echo chamber and the echo chambers that it hates. And never being surprised and never discovering anything new about the world means that you're not engaging with the actual world. And arguably, not arguably, I would argue that this has happened to almost all left-wing media, whose connections to social movements is honestly far, far looser and far more tenuous than that 2000s alt media that had so many problems and was so much smaller. That alt media, I would argue, was, because it was so marginal, was more connected to the on the ground street movements, and their issues and their experiences than left-wing media is today. And that's disgusting, because left-wing media is not a small industry anymore. It is actually like a relatively large, there's a huge amount of effective demand for it. If you advertise yourself as a socialist, you can get a lot of money from at least like armchair socialists. But how many of those people are talking about the big tenants union in the Bay Area tank? Or how many people or how many of those people are live streaming from the Floyd uprising? Or how many of those people are talking about all the million different things that are going on the ground that could be surprising or interesting, and that pertain to concrete left-wing politics? But they're not talking about that. They're engaged in these kinds of like, intramedia disputes with other media personalities. And the answer is that they're all doing it more or less, and you can see hopefully through this analysis that like it's because of the incentives, where it's actually through that conflict that they can grow their accounts, and through growing their accounts that they can grow their subscriber base. So that's the underlying thing, I would argue, or at least that's what I see from the inside. And I guess the last thing I would say is that, and I disagree with this guy a lot, and I don't like the turn that he's taken in recent years, but I have to give credit where it's worth. The only socialist writer, socialists are supposed to be the materialists, right? Socialists are supposed to be the people who look beyond the veil of ideology and the abstract debates of the philosophers and look at how things are actually produced and how investments are actually made. And through that, and through looking at the organization of production in society, can tell you as much or more about that society as what that society says about itself.
Well, that's what they tell themselves, yes.
Right. And yet it's the socialists who have been completely blind to almost all of these developments, and it's the socialist media who have been almost totally like mute on these developments.
The socialists been completely blind to most of everything since 1920. I mean, like, I'm sorry to be that much of an asshole, but like, we'd be kind of behind the times on most things.
Right.
But go ahead. Like,
well,
just agree with you more
so
emphatically than probably you want me to.
So there's one guy who has written about this, one article about this in his Substack, and it's Freddie DeBoer. And I disagree with pretty much upwards of 80% of what Freddie writes nowadays. I think he's deteriorated a lot in recent years. But and partly because of these very incentives, I think.
I think he's actually gotten better in the last few months, but
okay, I haven't been following as closely in the last few months, to be fair.
He's been making it clear that he thinks a lot of the post-left edge lords are are post less devs lords, and then it's all counterintuitive
Oh,
signaling.
he
And
has.
There's not a whole lot of substance to it. That's why Amy Therese like went off on him very recently.
I missed that. I've been kind of a hermit, so I could totally see that. But as of like when I was reading him a lot like last year, I was just kind of like fed up with
obsessed with like liberal legitimacy and stuff.
Right, so he's like obsessed.
Too kind to DeBoer,
but to give Freddie credit where it's worth, though, he did an absolutely baller set of articles, like last year and then early this year, about being a young writer in the current media environment and how to market yourself. And also, he did this other one that was specifically about the pigeonhole effect. I actually got that from him, my analysis is broader than his, I would say. I've talked a lot more about the underlying infrastructure than he ever does, but and I extend it back into the 20th century. But he's the only writer who's talked about some of these incentives, partly because of his personal experience of cancellation. And it is, it has to be said, it's the only writing that I found on this topic from a socialist point of view. It's not even to my taste totally, because as I said, I don't think he extends it back into the 20th century. I don't think he does a political economy of it that's very sophisticated. I think a lot of it is kind of his own positioning vis-a-vis like blue check Twitter or the identitarians, which is also kind of fraught because he also personally actually legitimately fucked up big time with his false accusation of that other writer.
I was about to say, like, part of the story of Freddie DeBoer, we have to be honest about, is that a lot of stuff he's complaining about, he also did.
Right. Yeah, that's the other thing
of his life.
And Sam Criss is another one of these where he complains
I don't even want to talk about him.
Right. Exactly.
Stop. No talk.
Okay. Sorry.
His name is. No, I'm kidding. You can talk about it.
Well, just he was an identitarian who was a ringleader against the guy who
Mark
suicide.
Fisher, and actually Mark Fisher. Shit that like I feel weird about publishing that Vampire Castle essay, but his pivoting on that
has been ridiculous without the acknowledgement of his role in the original ringleader stuff.
It's like I'm going to be one kind of shitlord, and now I'm going to be a different kind of shitlord right before I get canceled myself for something probably maybe not insignificant, nor did I totally deny it.
Right, exactly. And it's just this very frustrating set of maneuvers and politics that distorts even the good writing about this stuff. But to get back to Freddie just really quick, he, to his credit, he wrote about it though, right?
Yeah.
So that's and that is
actually even to Sam Criss's credit, he wrote about it a little bit. But those have been the only two people who really have. And let's see. What about an online media space to mimic AOC's 18 outside of two parties? You don't own the means of the media, and until you do, like, it's kind of a non-starter.
It's not about starting a nonprofit; it's about starting a platform. And even the platform requires network effects to really get off the ground. Of all people, Peter Thiel, son of a bitch that he is, actually writes pretty well about this in his book about startups.
He understands. The motherfucker understands to power better than we do. I hate it when the right wingers are better at what we should be doing.
Well, it also helps that he's independently a billionaire. So, but
we are billionaires and they suck. Like.
But
we do have billionaires. I mean, like, who do you think kept some of these like aging social democratic and old line trot parties in the United States around for forever? It wasn't mass membership. It was a couple of million. Well, they weren't billionaires. They were
I was gonna say I would say more like millionaires, like tenured professor types. But still, you add a couple of those together and you can get comparable money.
People who gave like a couple of who could give hundreds of thousands of dollars in 70s money to the USSWP. That's not insignificant,
right? No, it's certainly not. Yeah, but just to kind of wrap up this media discussion, I just think that sorry. One thing, the fandom thing, also kind of the smart strategy to take if you're the content creator is to take like a kind of risk management approach. And it's kind of grotesque because it mirrors some of the approaches that you would take as like an investor on Wall Street. It's basically true. Like if you treat your fandom to you like the John Michael Cologne fandom, which does not really exist to any great extent. But if I were to do this approach, if I had like 1 million followers, what I would probably want to do is kind of have like a little diverse portfolio, right? Because you want to diversify, your risk or reduce it by offsetting it or things like that. By kind of having your fingers in a couple of different pots, of the different factions.
I actually
and
do
then
this on
and then
purpose.
always thinking of an escape route into another asset class, and it's fucked up that you have to think this way as a
Can I
content
go into
creator
just
nowadays.
pure cultural creation as opposed to political cultural creation?
Yeah,
Can
let's
we
do
go
it.
into that? Like
Yeah,
like
totally.
that's everybody. I mean, that's basically you have to have that as your get out at any time, not because of the canceling scare, because let's be honest, the parasocial relationship is more damaging than the counseling because it leads to like in these media markets, if you're not growing, you're actually dying because of
Right.
attrition. And with if you start having not people who cancel you, people just lose the parasocial bond to you.
Right.
Like you can deflate in 6-7 months, maybe less, like faster than you built up for sure.
Absolutely. That's certainly true. Now, that might not be a problem for you if all you want is to remain a going concern, because
Yeah, but if you need
that depends
money
on your
to
costs.
right.
Because it depends on your costs. If all you need to do is pay rent, right? Then I mean, not to be like
You can't pay rent off
ridiculous,
of
but
like Patreon salaries for like what I bring in. I can tell you that. But
well,
yes.
it depends on where you are, right? I think that a lot of people
Well,
could
where
do.
could you pay rent for $500 a month?
Oh, 500 a month? No. I'm thinking like 1,200. Yeah. I was thinking like 1,200 a month. If you got
Yeah.
1,200 a month, you can probably get by.
No, I mean, like,
The
and some of these Patreons, even though they don't seem like months a month, are actually like middle class livings. Like
right.
that is something I saw. I mean, I specifically saw it with Zero Books. Like
Yeah.
the reason why we had full time staffers and not part time staffers is when we implemented a Patreon like 4 years ago. It within a year and a half more than paid for everybody's salary.
Right.
Like which we were constantly at risk of losing the rest of the time. So
And this is also why media ventures always start these spin-offs that are podcasts and YouTube channels, because that's the real money makers that subsidize the magazine. That's probably Jacobin's growth is a combination of that and some of this stock investing that seems to be happening, according to the consultant that they hired on one of their recent nonprofit. It showed up in their nonprofit disclosure paperwork stuff. I forget what the name of that forum is, but somebody dug it up and it was a minor scandal in DSA that they're investing in the stock market or something, or it seems like they are. But it's like it's complicated because I think that there's a legitimate need for thinking through how we can construct these independent spaces, and that does involve figuring out the revenue stream for them. And I think that people don't like to talk about that I would argue, for very American bourgeois reasons rather than for principled socialist reasons. Like, people don't like to talk about how much money they're making, or how much they need to survive, or where the revenue stream is coming from. I mean, like, we don't even know who owns the C Corp of Current Affairs, which seems to be like massively at issue in the kind of blow up that's been going on.
and that's in a fairly and frankly, Current Affairs, other than the co-op issue, had been a fairly ethical publication, and that's
right.
Like, it is still a Delaware corporation. Like, it's like Delaware corporations normally scream sketch, because your disclosure responsibility is so low. Like,
right.
That's why we don't know who the C Corp really is, and like.
Yeah, and it's it's like, I quite liked not only Current Affairs, but I liked a lot of the people involved. I met them because what you have to do is what I was saying, right? Like, where you go to these like parties and you meet people and you talk to them. And I was friends with pretty much both factions of the Current Affairs spat. I knew people who were involved. And the not like super well, but like, I met them and had pleasant relationships with them. I had a correspondence with Robinson, and it's just it's a really sad story. Like, before it's like a scandalous story, or a sign of the evil capitalist hypocrisy of the so-called like socialist press or whatever. Like, I mean, there's aspects of that for sure. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and like deny it, because it seems like it was a very ugly power struggle. but at the same time, you can see them struggling with the limitations of this kind of like, you know, small media like subscriber funded model. And the different factions had different ideas of how to navigate that. That ultimately proved irreconcilable, and like, you know, and led to the drama that took it down. And it's really fucked up. But I think that this is the kind of thing that if we don't theorize it, this is the thing. If we go on blindly reacting to things as we experience them without theorizing them, without codifying them, then we're going to be powerless, because all theory arises from practice. But in order to be able to like engage practically in a more like successful way, you have to be able to be theorizing why it is that you're reacting to the circumstances of your lived experience in the way you are, and what the structures are that are causing your lived experience to be in this way. Otherwise, you'll remain a machine smashing Luddite forever and never develop a workers' movement of the classical sort of the 19th and 20th century, right? To use an analogy. So in the same way, I think that there's a need on the left for an analysis of the media environment, that we have, and that we're operating in. We have to not just be like fish who swim through water without being able to perceive it, right? We have to be able to actually name the names and understand the institutional infrastructure in order to be able to accomplish our goal. And perhaps we have different goals, right? All of us on this big thing called the left. But my goal, at least, is and maybe this is a kind of good place to wrap up, I don't know, but my goal, at least, was always kind of what I said in the last episode. Like, I think that one of the big missions that I have in my life that I've given myself, and that the people who I most respect, I think, have a similar kind of mission, is to try to reconstitute a public sphere, you know, in the places where capitalism has basically completely desiccated it, and not only to reconstitute it, you know, in the manner in which it existed, you know, as this kind of like, you know, bourgeois, petty production, you know, but actually to reconstitute it on a cooperative basis, and on a basis that actually kind of allows for the free association of unalienated producers, you know, in the construction of their shared culture, and knowledge, like, you know, and to socialize media by creating a space, you know, creating institutional structures through which people can cooperatively and collaboratively generate new ways of thinking and seeing, and you know, transform the world as a result. Now that's overly idealistic, but it's the thing that motivates me when I kind of sit down and write for the left wing Little Mag Press, or try to theorize this stuff. And I just don't see, as far as media and the arts go, because this is like one problem among many that we have in our society. So I'm not going to sit here and preach and act as if it's like the sole thing that's important. But I think it's an important factor for any possible solution to the great crises that we have in the century. That's my hot take.